Emma Lenny Benye Unile Loko Esiku Dede Asiko Yi. Hello everyone, it's Adirunke again. I hope your day is going well. Today I'll be discussing the word Eru and the fact that it doesn't mean slave. I will also provide some background information into the culture, so it should be a fairly lengthy but educational one. A slave is defined as a person who is the legal property of another and is forced to obey them. Perhaps the definition should be modified. Well, I suppose that was how things worked back then. Something about this definition just bothers me. But anyway, that's the idea. The word Eru is nothing like it. Let's start with how people became Eru, because that would give very good insight into what the word Eru is, even before I break it down. Yorùbá people are very communal because protection and survival depended on it for millenniums, and being banished was one of the harshest forms of punishment, which in fact rings true in how people became Eru. Many people were banished by executive arms of the existing governments, and an example of those executive arms was the Oro body. And typically back in the day you would have heard "Won fi oro le nilu" when somebody was banished from the community, from the settlement. So they banished him or they banished her from the town through the Oro. Typically they were Ims many times, especially when active banishment was involved. There were other forms, but I'll get there. And many suspects who knew they would be sentenced to death or long periods of imprisonment also ran away, exiling themselves never to return. And several of them were women too. So typically when it involved active banishment, they were men, but there were also women. There were also women. It wasn't always men. There was a time when women were actively involved in the Oro too. There's an Odu that discusses like what happened. But anyway, that's for a different video. So the Oro would typically operate in the night. A lot of what they do takes place in the night. So they would meet probably the night before or maybe late evening or something, or they would have met to discuss somebody that was accused of a crime. Sometimes they would imprison them before. At other times they would not let them suspect anything. They would discuss their fate. Okay, this person has been accused of this, and what do we do? Are they to be executed? Are they to be imprisoned even longer? Are they to be banished? And all that. So one of the decisions they made at the time was banishment. And they would banish at night because there would be less intrusion. When they come to your house, they would when they came, they would roll the bull roarer. We call it ajauru. They would there's a way that they would fling it, and depending on how fast the person responsible for flinging it did it, that would determine the kind of sound that it would make. The louder the sound would be. So they operated at night because there was less intrusion, because it was more discreet, because it was more charismatic and also provided shock value in specific cases. It was also less embarrassing for the suspect, depending on the situation. So these, I believe, are some of the reasons. I'm sure there are more, but these are some of the clearly obvious reasons why they did a lot of things at night. Banish at night, or they would send away at night. Don't ever come back to this land. And that was as far back as millenniums ago, in fact. So if somebody was accused of stealing and they had won them the first time, the second time, and they were caught again, they would banish. And banishment was one of the reasons why people became Eru. So just a few things that you should know regarding the Oro. This is what the bull roarer looks like. This one is fairly old. and I think it's in one British museum, or maybe the British Museum, the main one. But this item is there. This is called ajauru, the bull roarer, and it's often made from perforated bamboo or specific kinds of wood. Is associated with Oro, the deity. The sound that it makes is called Onworo, and it's affiliated with the Ogboni and Oshugbo. The place where executions were done is known as Igboro, not just executions but other things, and the executioner is known as Aworo, and the people executed or banished were men and women, or advised to exile themselves as well were men and women, and the spirits of the executed are called Pakoko. I think that's what it is, because they hide or wander in deserted areas. So a person is accused of a crime. Using the Oro as a case study, the Oro seizes them at night, maybe even so that they don't run away, imprisons them somewhere, and when it's time for the person to be executed, probably for murdering someone, they would take them from the prison. The other members of the Oro would be outside. Maybe 2 people would go in and seize them and take them to the Igboro to be executed. These executive bodies were responsible for applying the punishment. So when those souls leave the body, they believe that they typically come back and visit, while other spirits are happy to be present around their descendants or their children, or be present on the land freely. They believe that those ones just wander in deserted areas. So they are called Pakoko just because of that hiding thing. And they have their own egungun. If they want to speak, they have their own mediums. It's a whole thing. It's a deep thing. But yeah, the people who become refugees because of Oro banishment are referred to as Eru Oro. So a song like that emphasizes the power of the Oro is in the song Boju Boju, in the Boju Boju song of the Boju Boju game. So the song goes Boju Boju. The people playing the game would say, oh, Oloro Mbo, oh, Eparamo, oh, Shaking Shi. The way the game is played is you have a group of children and somebody chooses to be the Oloro, the person who goes about catching people. Children play the game, even maybe less now, but at least when I was young, I played the game. Somebody would volunteer to tie their face with a cloth, or if there was no cloth around or no wrapper, cover their face with their hand. Somebody else. So somebody will choose to be the Oloro, and somebody would opt to close their eyes, whether with their hands, but typically with a cloth because of sweat or death. So people would run. The person who opted to close their eyes would sing Boju Boju. The people trying to find refuge so that they can hide from the Oloro will say, oh, Oloro Mbo. They'll sing. They would reply, oh, as they hide, they'll say, oh, Eparamo, oh, Shaking Shi. They can either say Mashi, or some people would say Shishishinshi. It's just the Shishishinshi is just a sarcastic way of saying open it. It's one of the games that children played to remind themselves of how powerful the Oro was, and the fact that the Oro would catch them if they do something bad. The reason I'm saying so is when everybody hides and people are no longer saying oh or responding, the Oloros, even the person covering the Oloro would immediately drop the cloth or drop their hands and hide too. So the Oro is expected to catch somebody, and that person becomes the next Oloro. I'll discuss this in a separate video. But if they didn't catch somebody, they would typically sing the song Eni Oro Kule Lori Ko Sheba Sheriale Okele Bamba Omi Obe Shororo Show. ẹni orò kúlé lórí kò ṣe bá ṣeré alẹ́ òkèlè bàǹbà omi ọbẹ̀ ṣòróró ṣó. So you were expected to catch somebody as an oloro. So again, it's just one of the oro will get you games, and it's in this book. If you have the Alawiye book, it's on page 74 of Iwekeji of the second book. So the game is discussed here in case you want to check it out. I also have the book for sale on my Etsy store. So that's the game. Another song that you would hear that emphasizes the oro is a song about a painful past. I'll address it soon. Bí ẹ bá ń gbọ́ pékélé pékélé, bí ẹ bá ń gbọ́ pékélé pékélé, ẹ má yà sọ́ọ̀tún ẹ má yà sósì, ilé olówó lóró gbà lọ. The oro will go to the houses of the rich. Ogun mélòó ló ṣojú rẹ̀ jà? Ogun ìjẹmọ́ ṣojú rẹ̀ jà. Ogun àdùbí ṣojú rẹ̀ jà. Ogun àdùbí lè lọ́pọ̀lọpọ̀. Ìwọ nìkan ló dápa sójà mẹ́fà. Ọ̀rọ̀ wọ mọ́ ó padà sẹ́yìn. Ó padà sẹ́yìn. Ó wá fèwé búra. Ìyá rẹ̀ ń ké lọ bí ewúrẹ́. Bàbá rẹ̀ ń ké lọ bí àparò. Ìwọ náà ń bẹ lọ bí ìgalà. Omi rẹ̀ ké lẹ́ńbù sébẹ̀. Lẹ́ńbù sébẹ̀ lẹ́tún fi ń wọ́mọ. The song is about the Adubi War and the Gemo War. Those two wars are pointed out in the song as being painful things that have happened to the Egba people of present-day Ogun State. So I have to say that historical lessons that involve Yoruba individuals and groups challenging British colonization, especially the ones that involve murders, massacres, and genocides, hand taught to children or discussed enough. A lot of Nigerians received British propaganda education, which is no education at all, because they defend it to the death. The same system has only been slightly modified and is still being used to this day. So when you say you're educated and you're saying things like Mungo Park discovered the River Niger, they are true from a British point of view. They are relative truths. So that kind of education, the Adubi War is barely discussed. I never heard of it when I was growing up, so it's not discussed at all. And I doubt that children now are being taught about these wars. So the Adubi War was a conflict in June and July 1918 in the British colony and protectorate of Nigeria, ostensibly because of the imposition of colonial taxation. Direct taxes were introduced by the colonial government along with existing forced labor obligations and fees. And the Egba people fought back, and it led to the death of a lot of Egba people and one British soldier. So when people hear this song, this bagada bagada bogudu bogudu, they tend to sing it like every other fella song. You know, not a lot of people Google, okay, Adubi War, or even ask Adubi War, Gemo War, what are they about? You know, there are actual events that happened that led to the deaths of several people by the British armies that were, well, the British army, the lots of them, of the soldiers that were in the army. On the 7th of June in 1918, the British arrested 70 Egba chiefs and issued an ultimatum that resistors should lay down their arms and pay the taxes and obey the local leadership. So there's a research paper that I have that details the events. I'm going to share it soon so that you can see. Lugard's system met with some initial success in Benin, where total conquest and the exile of the Oba had provided him with a relatively clean slate. Not without a fight though. When they began to threaten him, he went on exile, but not without a fight. But in Oyo and Iseyin, there was friction. In Abeokuta, nearly disaster. The process of creating a suitable traditional authority, followed by the institution of direct taxation and the means of collecting it, caused growing discontent in Abeokuta. Soon, violence broke out, and the irate villagers cut the telegraph lines and railway track in several places. A district head, one European, and a number of other people were killed in the uprising, and the inhabitants of Abeokuta were cut off from the outside world. The trigger of the violence was the June 7th arrest of 70 Egba chiefs on the order of the resident to forestall a breaking of order for refusing to pay tax and for disobeying the Alake. This was the reigning Alake at the time, although the Treaty of Independence was signed before Oba Gbadebo became king. The promise of, oh, we will let you have some power, we will let you remain king if you obey our wishes, or actually it was more like, we will let you have an independent government, do certain things for us, or let us have access to certain things, and they had the military power, they had the everything. I don't know if it would have been an easy battle to fight, so I guess that was why they just kind of cooperated. During the Adubi War, this was the king, and there are photos of him being invited to certain British functions, obviously for being cooperative. These are the photos of him. This one is 1904. Oshokalu was the king, was the reigning king when the treaty was made, but just a year or two after, he became the monarch. These are photos of him from 1904 when he visited England, and this is him in a car being driven, and him arriving at the CM house in Salisbury Square. Not everybody was invited. The cooperative ones were invited, so this is another indicator anyway that it was cooperative with their government. Which brings us back to the for disobeying their Alake part, because the British have their tricks. They were not punishing them for disobeying them, they were punishing them for disobeying their Alake, who they are somewhat and somehow forcing to do their bidding if he wants to retain power. So Resident Hire then issued an ultimatum that the dissidents should lay down their arms, accept to pay taxes, and obey their African leaders. Obey them. The thing is, if they, and it's even obvious in certain other European settings too, even with slavery, sometimes they make another enslaved person with the same color of skin as you flog you, and they use your own people against you. It's a really interesting system that they use. Failing the ultimatum, a detachment of Nigerian troops just returning from service in East Africa was deployed on the 11th of June, most of them Europeans. On the 18th, Egba rebels attacked the railway. Egba rebels, or people defending their land, attacked the railway lines at Agbisi and derailed a train in which there were few Britons. Some others attacked and destroyed the station at Wasimi, where the British agent Ashworth was either killed in the engagement of fire or was captured and later killed. There were other attacks at the roadwork station at Oba. The dissidents exchanged fire with colonial forces in these places over a period of 3 weeks, but by the 10th of July, the rebellion had squashed and its leaders killed or arrested. An estimated 600 people, including the British agent and the Oba Osile. I don't know why they often refer to kings as chiefs. That's another thing that they would do with terminologies. They would name the main Obas, the emperors, so to say, as district heads, and name other Obas of smaller territories chiefs, other kings of other territories, or monarchs of other territories chiefs. So I don't know what that was, but they were Oba Osile was a king of smaller territory. Oshile, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, one of the three. Gelly deduces from the claims recognized as justified by the Commission of Inquiry that the uprising cost over £55,000 in property damaged. Exile losses from the scorched earth operations by colonial forces are not included in this figure. Which brings me to the destruction of art and legacy. These people, they were kind of crazy in the sense that if they wanted to punish you, and not just them, even the Fulani jihadists, they would burn your art and your sculptures and your legacies. I'm happy that this, and I'm going to try to find more from the British perspective, this article addresses the scorched earth operations where they burn places where they feel like you might be hiding charms or you might be keeping charms. In the Fulani case, they would destroy them, artworks, anything that looks like, oh, I don't know what this is, they would burn. And they did not estimate it. Only God knows how much they would cost now, considering our heart, some of our heart that was stolen at the time is now being sold in black markets and auctioned for thousands of dollars. So I don't know how much they would cost now, but they did not estimate it. As a result of conversions and to prove their decision to follow either of the two Abrahamic faiths, Yoruba people, even before all this madness, were often convinced to submit their heart for destruction, a few of which are indeed burnt, but most of them were possessed by European elites and added to their collections. I don't know if some of the art in some of these places that were burnt were taken out, or if they were indeed burnt with the buildings. With the Adubi and the Gemo situations, I can't, especially the Adubi, I can't tell if the active stealing of art was involved. And I'm going to address one that happened in Benin that we have pictures of. King Okia of Nembe converted to Christianity and got baptized by Bishop Ajayi Crowther, after which the king was given a new Christian name, Josiah Constantine, and as was expected, the Ijo king handed over his traditional religion idols to Bishop Crowther to be destroyed. So these works of art are in England today. They were supposed to be destroyed, but they are in somebody that we must not name's private collection. Either there or they've been transported to the museum, one of the museums there. So a lot of the ones like this, though, that they tended to be really intrigued by, they kept in their private collections. They did not put in the museums. Ajayi Crowther would not have known that by submitting them to the church body, they would not be destroyed. They were in fact going to be auctioned off to certain rich people. I don't know if he would have known that. It was just a puppet. But it's really funny to me. This article addresses the missionaries. Recently, the Church of England apologized to Samuel Ajayi Crowther's family, well, the representative, the bishop there, for how they treated Ajayi Crowther, especially toward the end of his life, which further proves that, in fact, they knew that when he was useful, they treated him like the puppet that he was, and when he was no longer useful to them, they treated him badly. You can read the full speech, but this is it's barely an apology. But anyway, today we honor him, and in so doing, the Lord Jesus Christ, whom he served. Apart from discriminatory practices that he endured when he was in West Africa, even in England, he was discriminated against. They didn't really seem anything more than a dignified servant doing his Lord's work. So missionaries were no different from any other vocation, profession, or trade, in that from time to time disagreements broke out between them. There is little doubt that the isolation and loneliness they endured, combined with the often close living arrangements with other individuals from whom they could not easily escape, resulted in an occasional outbreaks of hostility. Indeed, it should be remembered that Few missionaries were as irritable and contentious as David Livingstone. Another obvious example comes from the late 1870s when the LMS New Guinea missionaries gave up convening a mission meeting largely because of perpetual disagreements between the senior missionary Samuel McFarlane and his two younger colleagues, Laws and Chalmers. McFarlane used his frequent visits to London to influence the directors in his favor. In effect, the mission split into an eastern and western section, pursuing sometimes wildly different objectives. Frequently, this one mentions Ajayi Crowther, which piqued my interest. Frequently, disputes were referred to missionary headquarters for arbitration, and missionary society secretaries in London were obliged to exercise the wisdom of Solomon in the near impossible task of settling by post petty disputes that had begun months ago and thousands of miles away. Henry Venn, for example, had to deal with unrest in the Yorùbá mission when Henry Townsend complained about Samuel Ajayi Crowther, improper conversation with a young female, and Charles Gulmer complained about James White's oppressive conduct towards certain natives and writing improper letters. You should, if you have a chance, you should read it because it is indeed funny. What that just shows is that at the end of the day, when we look at the past and we look at these people, we don't need to look through rose-colored glasses. You know, especially in the communities that they created that exist now and worship them, they are not in fact all that you think they were. But that's really up to you to do your own research. That was about the Adubi War. After he stopped being king, Obagbadebo, King Ademola took over, and he was just as much of a puppet. I think this picture was taken in England. This brings in Madam Fumilayo Ransom Kuti, Chief Fumilayo Ransom Kuti, who was able to gather women, and they were able to go toe to toe with him, so much so that they were able to exile him for 2 years, a little bit less or a little bit more than 2 years. They were able to, because he was really just doing the bidding of the British, and against his own people. So they had started to do certain things like attack the village women for not paying taxes, and the British soldiers, that is, and they would flog the women, and they would push them, and they would destroy their wares, and they would. So I think the women had it up to here, and they were being backed up by the Alake. Mrs. Kuti had to fight, and they protested, and they sang the song. Now I've been trying to find what the song was, or anybody that was among the group, which is very unlikely. They are probably all deceased now, or I was trying to find if anybody knows the song, but of course they don't teach you this in school. So, but the English translation is something along the lines of, Alake, for a long time you have used your penis as a mark of authority that you're a husband. Today we shall reverse the other and use our vagina to play the role of a husband on you. So they sang it in Yoruba. I tried to write that down in Yoruba, and I know that it may have probably been in the Egba dialect as well. So that was where I had the challenge of, okay, is there a way that I can convert that to Yoruba and then try to see if we can find a song that is close enough, but I couldn't find. In the Kuti family, they are revolutionaries for sure. Another war that occurred that involved Yoruba people fighting against the British rule was the Gemo War. And this was a picture that they took in 1910. After the Ijamo incidents, Egba will be subsumed under Nigeria. Okay, so yeah, the treaty included the assurance that Egba would be allowed to remain independent of direct rule by the British. They would have power over the Alake, but the Alake will still be the Alake. Will still have the typical powers that an Alake would have had, except that they would now be in charge of telling the Alake what to do and what to allow and what to disallow. So that was the treaty. The Gemo massacre, in short, was an incident in Abeokuta in 1914, which this one happened. The Gemo battle happened before the Adubi one. That led to the abrogation of the Treaty of 1893, in which the independence of the Egba Kingdom had been asserted. The widely condemned killing of 40 unharmed men, women, and children at Gemo was the subject of serious discussions in the West African papers as well as some English papers. The Gemo crisis was the pretext for the British takeover of Yorùbáland under the amalgamated Nigeria. One area activist, Shobi Ponlade, who was opposed to the Egba United government policy of mandatory labor to defer. It was a kind of, is mandatory labor not slavery? Except that they let you go to your own house to sleep at night, they force you to work. Compulsory voluntary work. So it was a kind of in-house slavery as well, which a lot of people don't know about. And this is just presently Ogun State. Mandatory labor system had been accosted in Ajura village by traveling government officials, including Adegboyega and Young. Ponlade died after his subjection to physical disciplinary measures inappropriate for his age. Ijemo people, convinced that justice had not been served, called for the removal of Edu, the government secretary, and of Alake, the king of Abeokuta. So they were calling for the removal of their own king, because their king was a puppet. From 13th July, soldiers had been called from Lagos and had returned in a fortnight without any action. The village meeting of the 7th of August, in which the Ijemo people insisted on the dismissal of the government secretary, led to the recall of the armed troop. Around 3:30 on 8th August 1914, they opened fire on congregated villages. This event, sparingly accounted for till date, mind you, sparingly accounted for, you know, the property that was destroyed is also sparingly accounted for. They don't teach you this in school. So I'm going to read from page 58 of the book Colonialism and Violence in Nigeria, so that we can get more information, so that I can discuss what happened further. Needless to say, the Alake at the time may or may not have called on British troops to help him, especially since they were calling for him to step down, and that may or may not have led to the death of several people. At the end of July 1914, the Egba United government ordered the arrest of a 90-year-old Ijemo section head, Shobi Ponlade, for refusing to order the people under his control to participate in a forced unpaid labor program to construct and repair roads in his area. Ponlade had refused in part to, the thing is, repair roads, yes, but for who? You know, how many people even had cars? The tearing of the roads and the modernization of the land was for the ease and comfort of the colonizers. The roads were not for so that the Gemo people can drive their cars without potholes. It was obviously for the colonizers. So, and they were not getting anything for it. But the people were smart enough to realize that. Ponlade had refused in part to demonstrate that the Alake and the Egba United government could not give instructions to his people and to him as the section head. Threatened by a challenge to its power, the Egba government reacted in a way that brought identity politics to a conflict situation. When he tried to arrest Molade in his village, the old man resisted and the police used force and bruised him. Molade was dragged to the court, which was controlled by those who had arrested him. Edu and British Commissioner P.V. Young publicly humiliated him. They put him in a prostrate position for many hours in the sun, thoroughly beat him, and tied him to a tree all night. As in, all night. 90-year-old man. Young later attributed his cruelty to goodwill. Molade had threatened to commit suicide. I think that suicide bullshit is still used to this day. Like even in non-European countries, even in America. But I guess they are Europeans that stole the land of the Aboriginals. One day we'll get into the story of the Aboriginals too. Molade had tried to commit suicide, he said, and tying him up to a tree was a way to prevent it. He added that there was no lock-up facility. There was no place where 90-year-old man, where will he run to? And that he could not trust the local guards not to release Molade. So the best way to keep him was to tie him to a tree all night. He and his cousin Odebi were convicted of assaulting a police officer and were ordered to pay a fine of £2 each or go to jail for 2 years. In a separate charge, Molade was convinced of violating the road construction ordinance and fined. An angry and humiliated Molade chose to go to jail. As the news of Molade's ill treatment and arrest spread, it energized all the fractions and forces opposed to the Egba government. The Egba government was essentially the British government. That they name it Egba or they put the Alake as one of its leaders, so to say, doesn't mean that it wasn't their government. Anyway, it energized them, including the pro-Christian party based in Lagos. When Molade died in prison after a few days, 90-year-old man that had been tied against a tree all night, what do you expect? No one believed the verdict of the post-mortem arranged by the... okay. This part I didn't see earlier. No one believed the verdict of the post-mortem arranged by the government that he died of natural causes. You know, could he have died of pneumonia? Could he have died of starvation? Was he beaten to death? Instead, anger and the energy to oppose the Alake and the Egba government grew. The Gemo people protested, calling for the dismissal of Edo. The Alake miscalculated by trying to bribe the Ogboni to side with him against the Gemo. Which brings me to the song that I was singing earlier, which I will break down soon, but don't forget about this part. It tried to bribe the Ogboni, and members of the Ogboni tend to be members of the Oro as well. Tended to be. Go address it soon. The Alake asked British Commissioner Young to arrest the Ogboni chiefs from Ijemo, including the high-ranking Oluwo. The British warned the Alake that colonial intervention would jeopardize the autonomy of the Egba, but his throne was now at stake because they wanted him to step down, and he was eager to get help from the British. Same thing with the constant reminder that we have today of how Ilorin became a Muslim state, a Fulani state, so to say. It was a Yoruba person calling for the help of the Fulani against his fellow Yoruba people that were coming from Oyo. So Obagbadigbo probably was a disgrace, I'm sorry to say. I'm sorry to his descendants. But yikes. In 1914, widespread riots broke out in the city and its villages. We will help you, but if we help you retain your government as king, you wouldn't even have any power at all. You're going to become a figurehead, but we will still in paper refer to you as the Alake. Are you satisfied with that? Yes. So, and it probably only reigned for, I don't know, 6 more years after this madness before he died. So was it totally worth it? Anyway, the colonial government, you can read this part. Sorry, I'm just trying to save on time. Uh, the colonial government chose to use maximum force to end the riots and gave Commissioner Wilson the task of putting down the rebellion. In 1914, he went to Gemo quarters to arrest about 20 people as a threat and warning to others. The commissioner gave the Oluwo, the Ogboni, Oluwo, the impression that he would be coming to attend a peace meeting. When Wilson arrived at Gemo with his army, he met about 1,500 unarmed people who were willing to talk. Instead, Wilson instructed them to hand over all their chiefs. No one obeyed his command. Wilson later claimed in his report that one of the crowd attempted to kill him and a British officer shot him. A British officer shot him. As Oshutokun tells the story, the shooting was a signal for a general fusillade upon a panic-stricken and unharmed crowd. Within a few minutes, the Oluwo, 2 of the Oluwo's wives, 6 chiefs, and 27 other people had been murdered in cold blood, although Lugard later presented this to the colonial office, and of course that would mean also to the queen or the king, as an act of self-defense, the Queen of England or King of England. Wilson ordered his troops to enter the Oluwo's compound, where they used machine guns to shoot the Oluwo's other wives and a young boy in their rooms. The massacre was followed by a callous approach to the burial of the dead. The British asked prisoners to collect the bodies in a single trench. See, these people are sick. Their practices were really sick. There was a time when they banned the worship of Shompono as well, of Obaluaye, because I don't even know what happened to those priests and what they did to them, those Babalawo, those Onishopono Babas, and what happened to them. One day I'll talk about it too, the time when the British government explicitly banned the honoring of Obaluaye. There are many untold stories that the thing is, this information you will not really find on social media, and they will not bring it to you. You have to actively. The good thing about doing research is when you learn something, it typically there's a reference to another thing, and when you try to do your research on the other thing, there's a reference to another thing. So it's not like all this information is compiled in one book somewhere or one website somewhere. A complete list of the atrocities of the colonialists. No. You have to actively find that information yourself. So, which brings us back again to the Oro and this war song. It says, Bí ẹ bá ń gbọ́ pékélé pékélé, bí ẹ bá ń gbọ́ pékélé pékélé, or gbagada gbagada, gbogudu gbogudu. If you hear sounds of arms, if you hear warning sounds anyway, you don't need to go left, you don't need to go right. Emaya sotun, emaya sosi. You don't need to shift to the left or shift to the right. The way that you would do an ambulance, you park to the right or to the left. You don't have to do that, because ilé olówó loro gbà lọ, the Oro is going to the house of the rich. Imagine, the king then was trying to bribe the Ogboni. The Ogboni and the Oro are a similar group. Perhaps the Oro was more actively involved in the executions and the actual punishment process, whether it involved executions or banishment or some other kind of punishment. And the Ogboni was more like, okay, let us sit down and let us decide it before the Oro. So the Ogboni would have been the judges, so to say, and the Oro would have been the police, so to say, or the wardens, the prison wardens, so to say. So that's kind of so they are not mutually exclusive, especially in the sense that some members of the Ogboni were also members of the Oro. Ile Olowo Loro Gbalo means the Oro is going to the house of the elite. So don't worry. Proper punishment will be levied out against them. Although they are the elite, even the king and his other elite supporters, they would be duly punished. Ogumelo lo shoju reja. How many wars have you seen? At least I've seen the Gemo and I've seen the Adubi, because they occurred probably 4 years apart. So Ogun Adubi happened in my presence. Ogun Ijemo happened in my presence. The Ogun Adubi was difficult. Was a tough one, especially considering 600 people. Not as many people died in the Gemo battle. Although I also have to mention that I've seen other research papers, other articles, even ones that contain interviews that address the fact that the British tended to, just so that they don't have that many people to account for, they tended to remove from the numbers of casualties. So if you have 60 people dead, they mention 10 people. If you have 800 people dead, they mention 500. That type of thing they did frequently. So they only mentioned the ones that seem like, for sure somebody's missing them, or maybe even in conjunction with certain natives that were their puppets hid the bodies of the rest. So they only accounted for just half or a quarter. It's recorded that 40 Egba people died, but there were probably more than 40. So keep that in mind. I'm trying to emphasize all this because these are not things that people would actively seek out in their leisure time. So I feel like it's necessary for me to mention them if I'm going to mention the Oro, for instance. I can't just say, yeah, there was one war called the Gemo and there was one war called the Adubi War or the Egba Uprising. I have to also let you know that these songs are deeper than they appear. The Bagala Bogodo is available for hearing on YouTube, so you can search for that fella's song. See, ìwọ nìkan ló dá pa sójà mẹ́fà. You are determined that you alone are going to revolt so much so that single-handedly you will kill 6 British soldiers. Ọ̀rọ̀ wọ mọ́ ò padà sẹ́yìn, but they were, it's a narration. It's like second person. You said, but it's more of a narration of what actually happened. Ọ̀rọ̀ wọ mọ́, it was no longer what you anticipated, so you ran back. Opada saying you ran back and you hid on the leaves. So it's just a description of just how much it wasn't a fair fight. Anyway, the British had all these arms and all these guns and all this, so it wasn't easy for them. This is another one. Apart from even the Yoruba people against British colonialist governments and British soldiers, European soldiers, there's also again, those are just 2. There are more. You have to do your research. You have to do your research, or probably I would dedicate a video to discussing as many as I can find. Before colonization, countless battles and attacks are taking place between Yoruba people and Fulani Islamic jihadists and their allies, which included Yoruba Muslims, many of which are seldom discussed too. Ilorin is a constant reminder. I think the fact that, do you know how many people the Fulanis killed before they took over Ilorin? Do you know how many Yoruba people they killed? What is not allowing that to die out completely is because of the recent Fulani attacks again. So I think that's another thing that is making people discover that these attacks are nothing new. Kidnappings are nothing new. These were the same people that kidnapped Samuel Ajayi Crowther and several other people that were not Samuel Ajayi Crowther. We only remember Crowther because he gained a bit of notoriety. So, the introduction of Islam to present-day Nigeria through the Malians and Fulanis was peaceful at first because trade aided the process. Then the jihadists determined to use force and the seizure of power in the establishment of the religion as the main one. So if you read Usman Danfodio's manifesto, so to say, jihadist manifesto, you would see that they were trying to take over the whole place and make the entire place a Muslim region. I think you will find English translations of it. You may find the Ajami ones or the decently Arabic ones. Maybe pure Arabic, or probably not, probably Ajami. You will find them. Anyway, the Oshogbo War of 1840. After the Fulani systematically captured Ilorin via the treason of Afonja, the field marshal of the Oyo Empire, the Fulanis, together with Malian and Hausa immigrants, made Ilorin their territory. They had immense assistance from some Yoruba Ilorin Muslims. Ilorin is a place in present-day Kwara State in Nigeria, which led to the sack. Oh, and the Fulanis also actively contributed in the destruction of the Oyo Empire. Actively. For administrative reasons, the fleeing Oyo citizens relocated the Oyo administrative center from Oyole to the present Oyoagu. The Alaafin devolved the military power of the Oyo army into the hands of garrison commanders like Ogumola, Kurumi, Timi, and Shon. The Fulanis had sworn to dip the sword of jihad into the Atlantic Ocean, probably in their own words, and they were still not satisfied with their victory. They wished to extend their rule deep into the heart of Yorùbáland and annex all the coastal cities of Yorùbáland into the Sokoto Caliphate. Thus, in 1840, they set to capture Oshogbo, a Yoruba town. The Fulanis, under the command of Ali, the Hausa Balogun of Ilorin, laid siege in Oshogbo. I wonder if that was successful, the way the Ilorin one was successful, I wonder if we would even be having Oshun Oshogbo festivals today. It would be as Muslim as Ilorin, But somehow, Oshun especially has been actively involved in the protection of Oshogbo. We have her to thank for that, and other forces that protect, other ancestors that protect. She just would not allow. This was not the only attempt to annex the government of Oshogbo, in particular, not just the colonial ones that happened and the subsequent ones, not just in Oshogbo, but other places too. So again, you have to actively research what happened in the 18th and 19th, even the 20th century, to understand what was really going on back then. So yes, apart from the Oro being powerful enough to banish anybody, irrespective of who you are, even if you're a monarch, even if you're a member of the Oro, but I think being a member, you had to go through certain tests and certain character checks, and but you were not free from punishment either. Anyway, people willingly left their communities and accepted advice to do so due to a wide range of reasons, not just crime. So apart from punishment by banishment, people also actively left for all these reasons. So family related issues, death threats, certain stigmatizations, diseases like leprosy. When you got better, you still kind of maybe sometimes couldn't deal with the stigmatization, so you moved to a different place. Famines and droughts, sexuality related conflicts. This one is another one that is not talked about. Well, don't expect the British to talk about it for you or to add it to your educational curriculums for you. But there was a time when I would say coming out, because were you going to make a YouTube video? Were you going to? There was a time when same-sex relationships were actively frowned upon, so much so that they were added to the Ifa Odus. The Ifa Odu can't be treated like a Bible or a Quran. That's why you can't call Ifa a religion, because it's very dynamic. It's constantly changing. So there are Ifa verses that address Islam, that describe many things about Muslims, which many people don't know, that there's no one body of work that can address all the essay of Ifa, all the verses of Ifa, of each Odu, of the 256 Ifa chapters. So typically they would just address the most popular two, and they would forget about the rest. But it's such a large body of work that no one person can actively know or remember every verse, except it's documented somewhere. When people try to say that homosexuality is a foreign thing, is an European thing, I laugh, because even before Europeans stepped into present day Nigeria, people were already being banished or advised to exile themselves for being gay. So much so that, see, Ifa speaks against any kind of sexual intercourse that does not end in reproduction. So it's not just gay people. It's if you're having intercourse in such a way that realistically may not lead to the birth of a child, Ifa frowns against it. But somehow with governments, especially when certain women seemed like a threat, they were banished from the land or advised to banish themselves. Just ensure that you are no longer here this time next month. We don't want gay people here. One of the ones that are cited is Iworiwofin or Iworiwodi. Basically, it's saying the fact that there was the need to address it suggests that it was happening and it was threatening to the development of the society, the way that those people who were involved in the creation of the compilation of the Odus, so to say, the way that they saw it. Remember, there were people like you and I that you can't treat it like a religion, because it really is not. Basically, it's saying it's pleasant for a man to have intercourse with a woman, it's pleasant for a woman to have intercourse with a man. If a man has intercourse with another man, it results in lumps and boils and yaws and various diseases. And if it's a woman with a woman, it results. The idea of it's a foreign thing and it just came, and that's a lie. Please stop saying that. That's a lie. We had ancestors that were gay. Now, they may not have been direct descendants, considering the fact that surrogacy and all these things, even back in the day, were even still frowned upon. Women who could not have children. Even the word agon is to humiliate, is to mock. And that's what barren women are called. As highly developed as we are in thought, there are still some minus, like it wasn't all perfect. With certain things, we were still very much exhibiting ignorance. It's important to note. Now, the reason why I said it may not necessarily be homophobia directly is because of this part. Oyedipe obo poro omo tuntun le ri aye bo igba idi di meji lo domo. When like it explains it, and I like this explanation, it is when two sexual organs that are opposite of the other. When they become two, not like when they are one, that is the same. When they are two, that you have a child. This one is about Iwori that used to have intercourse standing up. So again, exploring was also frowned upon. It used to stand, and I believe for that result, it was difficult for the woman to conceive because of the position. And this, like Iwori, oh, Sibere, why don't you bend, or why don't you lie down instead of stand? There are many. Again, it's not a religion. It's full of advice. It's up to you to take it or not, depending on. It's a very dynamic body of work. Very dynamic. Recently, there have not been too many changes. Considering the fact that we're now being influenced. Not changes necessarily, but updates. Updates is what you would have rather than changes. There have not been too many updates due to the influence of religions that are kind of static. So the way things were in 2000 years before is kind of what you're supposed to follow to the T. And although many people don't follow it, they pick and choose it. Like, for example, women should not be allowed to speak in the church. If they have something to say, they should go home and tell their husbands. You have women preachers now. So people kind of pick and choose what part of the Bible they want to follow, and they say, oh, that one is the Old Testament, but this one is in the New Testament. Well, but New Testament, but that was not how life was back then. But what about with other things that you are saying other people should not do? So there's a lot of hypocrisy. Even the Odifa addresses hypocrisy in Islam. Again, it's not a religion. It's a very dynamic body of work that got updated, not very frequently, but often. Before, we were influenced by all these other religions, and now it's just a static piece of work, which is still very much useful. Ìbáṣe báyìí là ṣèlú ìlú Ìbàdàn adífá fún wọn nílùú Ìwòrìwòdí níbi wọ́n ní kí wọ́n lé ọmọ òṣù wọn jáde, èyí tó lọ́kọ tó lóun ò lọ́kọ mọ́, tí yóò máa lẹ̀dí mọ́ gbogbo obìnrin ẹgbẹ́ ẹ̀ kiri. Ìwòrìwòdí ṣe bí nǹkan rere lòun ṣe. So we know that Ìwòrìwòdí is about a particular woman. The thing about this verses is they don't typically name I think in one, which I'm going to show you next, they actually named one Awele. They named one person, but typically they don't name. Typically they give you metaphorical names. They would give the person that Odu is addressing a metaphorical name. That was an actual person who lived in history, but they don't want to name them, so they use a metaphor so that not just them or those sets of people, but other people like them that may come in the future, so that they'll be discouraged from doing what these people did. They were instructed to drive out their married daughter, the one that was married and said has divorced her husband, and she arouses sexual appetite for her fellow women around. She thought she was doing something good. She was told to offer sacrifice. Obìnrin tó bá ń fẹ́ bìnrin ẹgbẹ́ rẹ̀, ẹ̀yin ò mọ̀ pé ó ń lọ wò kú ìdí. A woman who engages in sexual intercourse with fellow women, don't you know she's only gazing at their genital? Please don't tell me that homosexuality is foreign to the Yoruba culture. If somebody says that to me next time, I'm probably going to curse them out, because many things have occurred that Ifa doesn't even address, that occurred in history. Certain battles, certain wars that you don't necessarily hear mentions of them. But the fact that the Babalawos that compiled these Odus felt the need to include the one against exploring sexually and climbing up and standing rather than lying down when having intercourse, or felt the need to address women and women being together and men being together, suggests that it's not foreign. But I will leave the matter for a different video. This is another one that I saw that I'd like to show you as well. So, a lot of things were about the community and the progression of the community and populating the communities, considering a lot of things were happening back then, from child mortality to not so many people that existed in each community. Some other people were being punished for some crimes, and so you were having less people, and they needed the population, which is why anything that wasn't going, any kind of relationship that wasn't going to necessarily yield the birth of children was frowned against. Even sexual positions that would necessarily help facilitate conceiving was also frowned against. Yeah, so that's why I'm not really going to say, oh, it was specific to homophobia. It was many things phobia. So in Erosun, Eleri, you have something similar as well. If she do if she okay, now this one opposes the previous one, so it's most like, that's why I said it's a constantly being updated body of work. In the previous one, which is probably older than this one, it says, oh, don't stand. But in this one it says, if she bends, it's enjoyable. If she stands, it's enjoyable. If she lies down, it's enjoyable. It's a dynamic body of work. It's very obvious that it is. Adifafun Awele. This may not be the particular person that they were referring to here, that the person who provided this verse, the Babalawoda, this may not necessarily be the name of the person he was addressing specifically. It may just be, and it may be the real name, who will cause pandemonium and controversy with her. So we know that there was a woman who probably was Awele, or that was the nickname that was given to her, who had big buttocks, and she was breaking calabashes and breaking kengbes with a genital. Now, only a person who understands metaphors will really understand what they are saying here. If you know what a kengbe is and a koto is, you can have a decent picture of what they're. This one might actually be referring to bisexuality. Kengbes typically have longer necks, which, if you can see what I'm doing, will tell you the body part that I'm describing. Kotos tend to be different. So she will, with her genital, she breaks this and she breaks that. It means that she was, sexually active with people of either gender. So she wasn't going about breaking calabashes with her genitals. Obviously, it's a metaphor for something. So, but one day we will address all that. I don't want to do too much on that topic today, because it deserves its own video, doesn't it? Not to say that the other ones that I mentioned don't deserve their own videos. I'll address it as well. I think I've said that separately. If I can get a decent compilation of, colonial Yoruba people fighting colonial powers, and most of the time, of course, it led to the deaths of more Yoruba people, and maybe 1 or 2 casualties for the British, maybe 2 tops or 3 tops, because they had the guns. The villagers had the machetes, and maybe only a few people had guns, but they had the guns, they had the bombs, they had everything. So repression and so some Aroko are not discussed enough as much as others. If you look at this carry, what female body part does it remind you of? So if you take 2 and you tie them together and you send maybe a small covered bowl of honey and orange, and you wrap it in a cloth, and you tell somebody to give it to your woman, you tell somebody to give it to another woman that you are probably sexually active with, you know, it has a meaning. So, but anyway, but just be aware that this, when cowries came to be, that is, when cowries became legal tender, this was also a metaphor for, even before they became legal tender, this was a metaphor for something. Exclusive information, don't tell anybody. Okay, so yes, people traveled and explored, yes, but seldom settled, apart from marriage or something. People seldom just came. Even with marriage, the people from that one village will bring the brides to that village, that the husband's village, you know. It wasn't them just coming alone saying they want to stay there permanently. It was kind of weird. So people often had a specific purpose for being in a different community, knew how long they intended to stay, and had plans for returning home. The "I want to be a permanent resident here" thing was so weird. You typically stayed with your community. That was, of course, millenniums ago. Strangers in any village were immediately led to local authorities. Most of them inherently knew to report their presence and the purpose of their visit for security and economic reasons. You typically, you didn't just come to a village and linger around. You typically went to the Bale or even the Oba or the Baba of the community to state your business, if indeed you had the intention of living there. Many times Ifa even spoke about people that were coming, you know. Sometimes there would be divinations done and just certain indications that somebody special was coming from somewhere, and they should be allowed to live there and they should be taken care of because they're going to, their presence will result in the development of this, or they have this specific knowledge. But not in all cases. Not in all cases. Take a note of these words because they would be really important soon. Native or settler versus an investor or resident or visitor or refugee. What is Eru? Finally, now that I've given you a lot of background information, from sexuality to crime to family issues to death threats, I don't know if I've mentioned banishment, to several reasons, discrimination, stigmatization. People left their villages where they lived and settled in other places. It was helpful if they had resources, if they had the food and the things that they could exchange for survival, especially back in the trade by barter days. Those were some of the reasons why people became refugees, and I'll show you soon. What is Eru? The E in Eru is the noun maker. The Ru is the verb. So the person or thing, that then Ru is the verb. Ru has different meanings. In one context, in the context of things like water, but not just water, but especially water, it could be to mix with mud and become unclear or turbid. The mixing with mud thing would be water, but to become unclear or turbid, Ru. It could also be to blend or merge with a crowd or an unarranged set of people. Mo fẹ́ rú mọ́ àwọn èrò tó ń lọ sí ààfin ọba. I want to blend with the crowd that is going to the king's palace. So I want to mix with them so much so that I become one of them. You know, that are going to, the people that are going to the king's palace, something like that. It could also be to stir up or agitate. Agitators are typically called arulu, which doesn't have the same positive connotation as ajafetolu. This one just gives the impression of, see, double speak. If you call somebody arulu, you give the impression that they're a public nuisance, that they're just causing chaos. But if you say ajafetolu, they are fighting for the rights of members of the village, then it has a more positive light. Iruke rudo, the causing of chaos. Words like this have ru in them. Then it could be disorganized or scatter in daru. It could be to refuse to follow something or to rubbish something, like to rubbish it. So arufin, aruofin. In another context, it could also be to sprout or rise or develop, like in the words oruko and eboriru. So we say tenibegi loju igiaruwe is a very popular proverb saying. A Yoruba person would have heard it at least once. It could also be to aft, a sharp instrument or tool. And to aft means to provide with a handle. Ebami uru adami, oti kanlori, something like that. Help me haft my machete. The aft is broken, something like that. Haft. So those are the means. So in this context of people, eru would be the person, not thing. Air could be person, thing, but in this context, it's person. The air noun maker is used for people here. The person that mixes with the population in such a way that the original state, the original demographic is changed or adjusted. The person who mixes with a population in such a way that the original demographic is changed or adjusted. So a migrant settler, but more specifically, the term was used for refugees, not just any kind of migrant settler. Probably in the beginning, when capitalism and the building of wealth and I'm going to make myself significantly, I explained what the function of an oba is, in the first place in one of my videos. It's not just so that you can, rule over your people, is to protect them. I broke it down because sometimes you have to look at what words are in and of themselves to connect with a part of history that you would otherwise not care about. Refugee, perhaps all migrant settlers were called Eru at some point, but the ones who intended to take refuge, who intended to be there permanently or for as long as they could, they didn't have a specific date for when they were going to live there. Refugees, they were referred to as Eru. The reason people did not, live here and live there and live there was newcomers who were not already wealthy or influential in some sense did not get much say in their new communities administrative affairs. So natives were considered first for everything, naturally. And it's backed up by certain sayings that we somehow even still remember till this day. They are old sayings, but somehow we remember them to this day. There are many that we've forgotten, but we remember them. So the terms that they would typically use, the native or the original settler will be referred to as Omoilu. A visitor is Alejo. And people who visited other villages, don't get me wrong, especially when our traditional form of theater was being developed. So there are Egungun Alarinjo, or just in general other Alarinjo performers that would dance and sing, and it wasn't always and I've explained what Egungun is and the difference between an Egungun that is intended for mediumship versus the one that is intended for entertainment. I've addressed it in one of my videos. I'll link it so that you can see. So the visitors were typically just migrant workers that would just perform, and they would be given clothes and sometimes food, and sometimes, but they would obviously present themselves to the Bale first, or the Oba, whatever the case may be, and receive permission or license, and they would perform. And I don't know if they had to give something back to the king after perform. Maybe it was expected, or it was even customary, depending on the village. We are not monolithic, but we had perform. They were just under the visitor category. Then we have the oludokowos, the alejo pataki, the important visitor. Not to say that some of these other visitors, even the performers, but the way entertainment was viewed then, it was consumed, but the people who entertained were seen like jokers. So I don't know if they would have been alejo pataki. It's only until recently that we started to like really appreciate theater arts. But the investors, people who wanted to establish things or develop certain things, were important visitors. And then a stranger, which is more like a traveler, because of the ajo there, ajoji is stranger or traveler. And then the eru would be somebody that just comes, wants to live there permanently, but doesn't really fit any of the other categories. These are sayings that further establish that, and there are statements that you would even hear today, and people still use them in specific context. Ori ni mo fi riwa, silu iki ishese. I came to this settlement, to this town, with my head, not my feet. It's one of the statements that you would hear when people want to emphasize that they are in fact original members of a particular community or space, and they have a right to say something or to do something, or or this other person doesn't have a right because they came here with their feet. That is, they were not originally born here, or their parents or grandparents were not originally from here. They came here with their feet. And then you hear challenging statements like, Ibo ni olori baba re wa nile? Where's your father's graveyard on this land? Which is another way of dismissing the opinions of a newcomer. Like, you don't have a right to even be here in the first place. You should be grateful for the opportunity to have to speak, or you should be grateful for you being here, or you don't have a right to contribute to the administrative affairs of this place. Where's your father buried? Where's your father? Of course, if you're a refugee, your father is not buried there. Your father is buried where you're from. So this is another statement that was intended to challenge people's legitimacy or rights to contribute to certain things. Why was an Eru different from an Alejo Pataki? It was because of the resources. Our communities were not monolithic, but in general, we were never opposed to the idea of receiving and housing visitors who seemed to have something to offer. And that was the reason why we were able to receive foreigners as well. That was why we were open to foreigners. There are certain cultures that to this day still have a trouble. I wonder why they are still trying to, though, but Europeans still have trouble with colonizing them. I mean, they don't have a right to. I don't know what guts they think they have, but till today, Europeans still try to, we are our way of life is the better one, and all this nature. You need to have tall buildings and washing machines. They still try to penetrate there, and they still get shot with arrows. So a lot of those, though, within the past 50 years have been in those communities. A lot of them have been a little bit more receptive than they would have been decades before. But we're never like that. There was never a time when we were shooting arrows at foreigners or shooting. We are highly receptive of visitors, especially the ones that we think are important ones. Highly. There's till today, in the average Yoruba home, there are visitors' dishes and visitors' plates and visitors' this. And even if they are not exclusively reserved for visitors, they are used exclusively for visitors. They are the special one, the best ones. There's never been a point in our history when, I think that was why, from the Malians to the Portuguese to the British to the Fulani to the Fulani, the Malians, the Portuguese, the British, they never had trouble. They never had trouble with us when it comes to settling down and, you have all this many things to offer. My goodness, please feel free. But of course that has backfired, hasn't it? So, the British were a little bit greedy. Not to say that the Portuguese or the Fulani were not bad people, or we didn't have bad ones, especially with the Fulani that were attacking our villages and trying to annex power in the name of Islam. Not to say, but the British were a little bit too greedy in the way that they did their own, because they bullied us into colonization. I'll allow you to keep small power, but I'm in charge though. The ones that, especially the Fulani, their own is, give me the power. They didn't play too many tricks anyway, as opposed to the British. But British were pretty greedy and played many tricks. And the treaty of this, they would create the treaty and they would annul the treaty and they would make the laws and they would, sick. So, but if you were not an Alejo Pataki, you came to the village, what is your name? You probably gave a different name, not your real name, but maybe you could have also given your real name. Well, what are you here for? I'm here to live. You don't have any business, no or resources for starting up one. You don't have any proof of social or political power. There were people who exiled themselves, but they came with donkeys. Even when we had horses, and they came with their own families and workers, and animals and all kinds of foodstuff and all kinds of. You don't have any of that except the cloth that is on you that we were banished with. You don't have any identifiable distant relatives or friends. What typically helped with having distant relatives and it was distant relatives in other parts were typically created through marriage. So if you were from that community but you were married to that community, and somebody from that community gets banished, but they recognize you, or maybe, well, not just recognize you, have a very good relationship. Maybe they're your family member or your friend, or you just know yourself somehow. You know each other somehow. That would have helped in surviving. You would work for them and all that, and work for your upkeep, of course, but that helped. So you don't have any of that, and you don't have any practical means of survival. Typically you were assigned work. If you're going to survive, okay, you don't have anything, no clothes, no this, no. Why did you leave that village? Oh, I just left. Oh yeah, bullshit. You were probably banished or something. Okay, you were assigned work, and you typically worked for the elite, for the monarchs, for the chiefs, for the local leaders, and by working for them, you would have the food that you need, the clothing that you need, the shelter that you need, the friends or partners that you need, and a sense of belonging, whether it was true or not. And the reason I'm going to say whether it was true or not is because of the few these other sayings that I'm going to be addressing, whether it was false or not, whether it was false or not, there were still some statements that really showed that they were still differentiating between refugees. Again, remember, before the cowrie system was introduced, it was trade by barter. Do this for me and I give you this service, or I let you do this, or I give you this product, or I give you this. So that was how, if you think of it as they were not paid, not the salary system that we now use, or the by hour wage system. No, the way people were compensated was different. So look at it from a historical lens. So, but you got all these things anyway. You got clothing and food and shelter. Typically, when the elite person wore clothes and they didn't want them anymore, they will give them to you. 3 square meals will be taken care of. You have the shelter that you need. You have the friends that you need. A sense of belonging that you need. It was an opportunity for a fresh start. But it was still a kind of punishment. This statement, Ki eru mo ara re leru, ki wofa mora re ni wofa, ki omo luyan fanda. It's in one of Ayla Omowura's songs as well. Let the refugee workers know that they are refugee workers. Let the bond servants, this one is a newer system. It's definitely, it was poverty and famines and droughts that brought about the bond servant system, because people were borrowing money from the elite. Before the elite began to get so rich that they were having significantly more than others, it was just this refugee servant system. There was nothing like the warfare system. So I have to make, it was when people started to hoard wealth and all that you now had, okay, your daughter can work for me until you're able to pay the money that you owe me, and all that. So let the bond servants know they are bond servants. Let the natives revel in their enjoyment. So it's very obvious that there was still a differentiation between people that were natives and people that were refugees. There's also imodo eba se bi elede abaluje, eru ibajoba eniyan iba ti ku kan, eni ti yo je ogun kogun itokitan ni yo pa. So what that means is, if a warthog were to assume the position of a pig, they would ruin the settlement or town because they have horns. We have another saying, oh wumodo ko se bi elede iwo ori re ni oje. A warthog would also like to be treated like a pig, because pigs are domesticated, pampered like a pig, fed like a pig, but they have horns, larger horns, that show that that is not a pig, that is a warthog. If a refugee were to become the monarch, there would be no one left. If a refugee were to become the monarch, there will be no one left, which is not necessarily true, but it's kind of a way of saying, because they don't have direct recent blood ties to you, then they may destroy the land because they don't have any emotional attachment to ensuring that that particular community survives or is well established. And it's based on the saying, koseni to ma gun ẹṣin tí ò ní sọ̀pá kọ́ lùkélùké. Nobody would ride a horse without throwing their head back. No one can ride the horse without swinging their head backwards vainly. If they don't want to, the horse they are on will make them. Kò sẹ́ni tó máa gun ẹṣin tí ò ní sọ̀pá kọ́ lùkélùké or sọ̀pá kọ́ sẹ́yìn. Tí ó bá fẹ́ sọ, ẹṣin tó gùn á jẹ́ kó sọ. It's a Yorùbá saying that references the possibility of a person to misbehave once they get in power. Even before they assume that power, they had said that they were going to be good people and not do this and not do that and not misuse the power. But power, there's a way that power drives you to misbehave, and that is what this saying is about. This short video shows what I'm saying about the nobody can ride a horse without throwing their head back vainly. That walking in such a way that you'll train your head back, you know, that train your head back gesture anyway, whether while work, riding, it's a haughty, it's a vain gesture. So that's what the saying is. It's based on that saying that anybody who has power, in fact, will want to use it, so it better be in the hands of somebody that we can tolerate as opposed to somebody that we don't even know much about. Another statement again, that because it is through these proverbs and sayings that you can really get to at least what's left of them, what's left of what we remember. That you hear some proverbs and sayings and you go, how long has that existed? You hear it from another, and then they will tell you, oh, this was a popular saying in my day, and you go, oh, I've never heard that before. So of what we remember, what is the popular ones anyway, we can from those sayings try to get an idea of what people thought of Eru, of refugees. The child of a monarch does not fight like a refugee servant. And what that relates to, Omobaki, Jagunbieru, what that relates to is, as opposed to a prince or princess, Omoba, the refugee fighter, refugee servant, again, when you come, you work for the elite. So depending on what you look like, what your past life was, depending on whatever skill they can detect in you, maybe even your gender and all that, they would assign you somewhere, give you a kind of work to do. If in conversations with you, you mention that in fact, maybe you are a skilled killer, maybe you killed somebody, I'm sorry to say, where you came from before you, typically the punishment for that would be banishment, of course, but let's say you would be execution rather, of course, but let's say you exiled yourself, you ran away, and you mentioned that in fact you are a skilled killer, and you can, let's say the town that you run to has issues with where you are from, you can say, oh, okay, I can join your army, and this was much later, of course. This was when battle started to come to be. I can join your army in fighting against the attacks, and from there, yes, and I know their secrets, so I can help you. It wasn't always like, okay, farm work that an Eru was doing, or kitchen work, or entertaining the monarch, or entertaining the chiefs, or running their errands or something. It was quite diverse where they were assigned. So as opposed to a prince or princess, the refugee servant fighter, the refugee fighter, battles like they have nothing to lose. They fight for rewards and a chance to improve their fortune, so they give it their all. That is what is emphasized in the Omobaki Jagubieru saying, and people still use it today. Oh, I can't fight like you because you have nothing to lose, so why should I fight like you? I'm just going to walk away. So you hear that. There are only a few orally recorded stories of refugees and or their children getting adopted, even when greed came into the picture and the sale of people became a thing. Biaba Kairu Inueru Abaje is one of those popular ones. Take this and give me that. That's a sale. The transaction may not be with cowries or with what the modern cash that we use now, but that's an exchange. So it's a sale. You can have her and give me all this, let her work for you and give me all this. That's a sale. So even when that came into the picture, there were still certain people, especially women, that were on the beautiful side, or that were prisoners of war or refugees of war, depending on the situation. There were some of them that got married into wealthy families. They still encountered discrimination, and there were some of them that got adopted. There's one story in Alawiye book 4 regarding a refugee servant that was exchanged for something, that was bought, so to say, along with their mother, and adopted by the elite person that adopted them. And they genuinely thought they were the child of the elite person, because they, of course, they were bearing their name and everything. And back then they didn't actively use last names, they didn't actively say, it wasn't this the name, it was like this or more, the mother or the elite, so that's another thing to note. I'm sorry you can't see, there's a little green screen echo, but the book is in book 4. The book is in book 4 on page 42. So he said, Dad, we have all these servants, refugee servants living with us, let us count them. And the father said, we don't need to count them. We don't need to count how many. Yes, we have many people living with us, but we don't need to count them. And the child insisted. And when they started counting, the elite man the rich man pointed at the boy first and said, I'm actually not your father. I got you and your mother. Typically, when they have wars, like, okay, I'll get to it. I'll get to the battles. The refugee was the initial kind of Eru, but I'll get to the other kind soon. There are sayings that show that indeed the humanity, the humanness of refugee workers was recognized. There are several. One is Biashe Bieru la Biomo. It's a very old statement. Especially when ill treatment was observed, the elite definitely took advantage of the fact that they were desperate in many cases. So I think that was what brought about statements like this, like, oh, you can't just slap this person like this, or you can't just mistreat this person. Like, there was a story it's a more recent story, by the way, of Efushetu Aniwura, who had Eru. I think she got a lot of her Erus from making them prisoners of war, though. But she was kind of okay in the way that she treated them until she was not. She lost her only daughter while the daughter was pregnant, and she demanded that none of the Erus get married or have children. It's a popular part of history, and if she caught any of them with children, they would be severely punished, or that child would be killed. She was friendly, but then she kind of became mean when she lost her child. You can read up on Efushetu Aniwura. But this one existed before Efushetu Aniwura. This is not about Efushetu Aniwura. Efushetu is, at least the fact that we still remember our story so vividly shows that it's not all that long ago. Biashe Bieru Labomo. The refugee was birthed the same way the child was. So you don't need to treat them differently or take the luxury of the fact that their people are not around to speak to them this way. And also, Onoloji Eruni Baba is another one. The distance is only far. The refugee servant also has a protector. I've explained what Baba is, that it's the exact same meaning as Oba that it has in and of itself. It is not Baba. Baba is different from Baba. I've explained it. So the distance is only far. The refugee servant also has a protector. Means that they also have a community that they are from. Again, yes, some people were in fact accused of certain wrongdoings, and some of them were stupid too. I'm going to read one to you soon. One account. some of the so-called, like sexuality and stigmatization, naturally, no. The reason why many people were banished, some of them were not crimes, which was why the option of banishment even existed in the first place. Usually for murderers, they executed them, the Yoru executed them. The distance is only far. The refugee servant also has a protector. They have their own community. They are not, again, they are refugees, but they are people. The distance is only far, but they also have a place that they came from, and they would not be happy with any kind of ill treatment. So typically when sayings and proverbs like this come to be, they are usually indicators of the fact that perhaps somebody somewhere did something that was a little bit out of line with the way that they treated these refugees. And so these sayings starts with this saying, and then it circulates until it becomes established as, like, okay, a proverb or a saying that people will quote anytime they see something similar occurring. So it's my cue for, yes, probably somebody did something, and somebody had to say, oh, the distance is only far. They also have their own community. You don't have to treat them that way. So, but there are other things that I'd like to say in that regard, which I'll say soon. When a refugee servant dies, their mother does not hear of it because the distance is far. Because probably they were banished or they are exiled. Nobody knows who their mother is or who their father is. We just know that they are a refugee living with us. When they die, their mother does not hear of it, but when a child of a native dies, there is wailing. Yet, the refugee servant was once like the child in their own mother's house, in their own native land. So it just further shows how unfortunate their situation is to have to be refugees. It further emphasizes how unfortunate the general population thought it was. With greed, this is one of the things that contributed significantly to the transatlantic slave trade, and I'll explain. Several millenniums ago, when life was simple, people took turns on working on one another's projects. We will build my house together, and we will build your house together, and we will work on my farm together, and afterward we will work on yours, and afterward we'll work on his, and afterward we work on hers. It was a lot more communal in practice, in the way that they did work. Nobody had to be the servant of anybody, or nobody had to. But when elitism began, then you started to have this class differences. So with battle, economy building, and empire creation, you typically have greed and the need for ownership. At first, ownership was not established in the relationships with Eru. It's important to mention they were expected to be loyal to whoever took them in for a set period of time, like any worker. So of course, you won't destroy their property or steal their stuff. You won't do anything that they won't like. For some people, maybe they don't want you to date their daughter. You won't date their daughter. There were instances of refugees falling in love with the children of the elite that took them in, and of course, I think I could have been a movie or something. I think they were trying to depict something like that, but the storyline just went south. So I don't know. But there were instances like that where people found love in the most unlikely places, and sometimes it would typically result in the Eru being sent away from that land, and so they have to start afresh, really, and look for another community to settle in. And sometimes the child of the elite will run away with them, and there are many stories like that, countless. They were then established with the Eru was then established with their own small-scale business or franchise, or they were set up with the means to establish their business. So they were free to leave whenever they wanted. This is what I like to emphasize. They were refugee. They were not owned. They worked for you, but typically, though, a lot of them would decide not to leave and to live there permanently because, there's no point of starting afresh and being. At least people are getting used to me here. There's no point of going somewhere else. Except like the people they were working for were too difficult to work with, so they went to another elite and said, oh, I'd like to work for you instead, or something like that. They typically just remained with that one person that took them in and gave them clothes when they initially came into the community. Or sometimes even that elite will say, oh, I'd like you to stay with my friend and work, and he will take care of you just as I've been taking care of you. So it's not a one size fits all thing. But one thing I like to emphasize is that they were free to leave anytime they wanted. But when empire building came into place, Eru became symbols of influence and power. When empire building started to, when all these empires were rising, having Eru workers who would do free labor for you. Yes, you fed them, and yes, they would, but just attacking villages and forcing people to work for you in your own community was crazy. Attacking villages or settlements, capturing or kidnapping their natives and forcing them to do free, unrewarded labor was observed when empires began to rise and fall. Fulanis did this to accept that, as opposed to taking them to the north or taking them to Mali or taking them to some other places, they sold them to the Portuguese slave traders instead. That was how a lot of Portuguese, I think that was how Samuel Ajayi Crowther was sold. That was how a lot of people were sold. Yeah, people would just go, and I'm going to mention a few of those battles. So the sense of ownership meant that those people, that those prisoners of war that were now enslaved, when you're not free to go, you're enslaved. Like, it doesn't matter if you're being given clothes or you're being given food to eat, you're being fed so that you can work well. Ownership meant you were no longer free to go, and people would start to include statements like this in prayers. So you see this seismic shift in thoughts. Whenever I hear that, I look at people with disgust. That in 2022, what do you mean by ekeru? You will bring displaced people who will most certainly be enslaved, and properties, loot, home. It's a typical prayer that was said to warriors and battle people, especially when empires began to form and began to rise. It's one of the statements that they would have. And the funny thing is that it was within that Yorùbá. Again, I explained it in the video on Yorùbá, that now we see ourselves as one big family, and we recognize, maybe more often than we did in the past, we recognize the fact that we all came from a common ancestor and all that. And we, of course, the language, the everything binds us. Even if we have this many different dialects, we are still one Yoruba people. We were not always like that. I mentioned that the Egba were in fact the last people to come into that camaraderie thing. It was like, oh, okay, we've been utterly destroyed. The British have taken over the power. Our kings are now figureheads. Oh yes, we are now one big family. But when we were fighting each other and seizing people to be enslaved, somehow some of them ended up with the Portuguese, some of them ended up with the British as slaves. We didn't think that we were one happy family. So people started to say this statement: you will bring properties, you will bring enslaved people. You ekeru wale. We don't have anything much. Even our art, maybe like 90% of what the ancestors gave us, as far as art and sculptures and messages are concerned, they are stolen, burnt in all these stupid Scotch earth operations that the British were doing, or all this stupid willingly burning your own part of history that the Yoruba people were doing, or that the Fulanis were doing after people converted to Islam and all that. We don't have much of those anymore, and even if we try to share with the ones that we have from millenniums, from centuries ago, in fact they won't go round. But we have the language, and we should cherish the language, because that's the one that we can keep alive, because it's not physical. That's the one we should never lose. So properly naming captives to reflect their correct conditions, to reflect that they were kidnapped and enslaved, that is, rather than the regular refugee that came into the land and opted to live there and serve for survival. Properly naming captives to reflect their correct conditions, to reflect that they were kidnapped and enslaved, forced to be refugees, was something the culprits and the general culture couldn't bring them. It's something we could never bring ourselves to do. That's double speak. When you don't differentiate between an Eru that had a choice and an Eru that did not have a choice, a refugee that walked into the land versus one that was captured and forced to be a refugee worker, then you have an ethic issue. Probably there are other statements, they just didn't get circulated as much, that try to say, but there's a difference between people that you've gone to capture and enslave really versus willing refugees. But obviously, there was, people were going crazy back then. There was greed and all this madness. So obviously those ones would not have made it until this era. These are the ones that made it. This saying reflects the seismic shift in popular culture and the accommodation of enslavement. People say till this day, it is suitable for an enslaved person to run away. It is also suitable for their elite person who wants their complete devotion, as if to say, to search for them. You can see the change in thinking now. It's no longer Basheveru Labomo or Onoloji Erudi Baba. You're now having statements that are starting to accommodate the madness. An enslaved person is supposed to run, but also it is why would they want to run if they are free to go? It's obvious that at this point their rules were no longer free to go. I don't know if people at this point were now willing. Of course, the communities were getting larger and all that, and the empires were forming. I don't know if people were still going into different. I know that banishments were still occurring, but I don't know if people were still willingly going into communities though to say, oh, I would like to live here, like the initial Erus. And I don't know if there was any difference really between the ones that walked in themselves and the ones that were captured in their own villages and towns and communities and settlements and forced to be refugee workers. I don't think there was much difference in treatment. But something here just shows the change. It is suitable for an enslaved person to run. But it is also understandable if the elite person that they work for runs after them to capture them. Now we have a problem. So it shows the seismic shift in thinking. When it shows a kind of madness, doesn't it? So slave trade as a means of wealth acquisition, while banishment continued, making people susceptible to kidnappings and enslavement, the exchange of criminals and what I mean by criminals, I've mentioned the ones that have not really done anything bad crime wise, but are seen as criminals or are counted as criminals, and prisoners of war. They began to exchange these people for goods and products. That became a thing, especially in regions that are closer to the Atlantic Ocean. So if you look at what is now the Nigerian map from here. And there was no Nigeria then. Or even Dahomey, even these places, Dahomey, for instance, was under Oyo. Before the Europeans sat down and said, oh, the French can have this, and with the English we would have that, and they shared Africa like a piece of cake. Before then, we were just one region. Dahomey was under Oyo. They paid taxes to Oyo until 18 something. I'll get there soon. So all these communities, even the non-Yoruba ones, participated in the, from places like Ogun State, not sure what part Ogun State would be, to Lagos and all these places. Yeah, these are prisoners of war. You can have them for stupid things: mirrors, guns, gunpowder. Villages that did not want the madness but did not have the means to defend themselves against intruders were easily destroyed and made desolate. So don't think, oh, every village wanted the madness. Not everybody wanted the madness, but if you did not want the madness and you did not fight, you were weak. And because of the intertribal battles and the stupid fight for supremacy, and it was not just within present-day Nigeria, of course. You had the Dahomey versus the Egbas, the Oshogbo versus the Bado versus the Ilorin versus the, Ilorin / Fulani people. External forces wanting a piece of the action, free labor. You capture people from this community, you bring them to your own. They do all this work. They build your empire. The foreigners are like, so we can do that too with y'all. They started to sponsor the wars. They started to sponsor the battles. So they would provide this set of people gunpowder and guns, and with the understanding that once they fought those wars and they won and they captured all those people will be delivered to them to be taken to whatever parts of North America or South America they were taking them to, or what other continent was actively involved in receiving enslaved people. Of course, it peaked because they were sponsoring it. They were sponsoring the fighters, the ones that wanted the supremacy. Oh, yeah, we'll give you the guns. They would approach them. Oh, we would give you all this. We'll give you the gene, and we will give you all these things that we've brought from Europe, or from Europe, but with the understanding that you will give us the people and you will give us the art. You will give us whatever sculptures or whatever works of art. Works of art. We'll give you their works of art. We'll give you their villages to be enslaved, to be taken away. I don't think that they had a decent idea of how much mistreatment these people were going to suffer, because they treated these prisoners of war like, I don't know, when I see pictures, not even videos, because with videos you may have a little bit of fiction. When I see pictures of the backs and the hands and the bodies of people who were enslaved, oh my goodness. If that was how, and I'm not making an excuse for the scum of the earth that were responsible for capturing people, and I'm going to mention some of the people that were captured soon, especially some of the ones that may strike a bell in your mind. If that was how we people that we now call ourselves Yoruba people, if that was how we treated one another when we captured, I'm pretty sure that the enslavers would have taken note, and I doubt that people who were enslaved in all these North American and South American countries would make any attempt to run back, to Africa. Some people were kidnapped from their mothers and fathers and sisters, and all they wanted was to see them again, and they died in the process of trying. That is to say, it wasn't just Africans getting the captured people, enslaving people. When the business peaked, these Europeans were doing raids themselves. So it wasn't just, oh, let the West Africans do the battling and let them do the capturing and the enslavement. So let them do the capturing and we will do the enslavement. They were also actively involved in raids. So that's another thing to note. And the saying that relates to this is the saying, "Bí ògiri ò bá lanu, alángbá ò lè wọ̀." If the wall does not open its mouth, if it doesn't have cracks and holes, a lizard cannot enter into it. We were fighting one another and destroying one another, and that was what made it easy for the traffickers and the enslavers to do their work. Rather than standing together to fight them, we were fighting one another. And then some of us were delivering captives to them to be taken away. Quarters to be filled and work to be done resulted in insatiability. There was even more demand, and they would take up to 200, 300, 400, put them in horrible conditions. They would take them at a time in a huge ship to the Americas. And the rest. A lot of the people who were, or whose clan was responsible for the selling of prisoners of war and criminals to be enslaved for labor were also enslaved. That's why I'd like to read the story of Olaudah. I always like to read the word for word account of people's experiences because nothing beats it. According to his memoir, Equiano was born in Esaka, Ebo, in the Kingdom of Benin around 1745. So this is most likely Igbo. The village was in the southeast part of present-day Nigeria. In his autobiography, he wrote, "My father, besides many slaves, had a numerous family, of which 7 lived to grow up, and that he was the youngest son." So I don't know if it's a colonial influence, but the meaning of Eru quickly changed. I don't know what it is in the Igbo community. I've just in great detail narrated how things came to be from the Yoruba perspective based on facts. In most West African communities, I don't think somebody would just go to their neighbor's house and point at their kid and say, "That kid is now my slave." Typically they were either foreigners, refugees or something. So I don't know if they were his father's slaves or they were the refugees working for his father, and that he was the youngest son. It stated that his father was one of the elders or chiefs who sat in judgment with other elders to decide what to do about disputes or crimes. So that would be the equivalent of Ogboni or Oro or something in Yorùbáland. It refers to men called the Onyigbo, probably not Oyebo, those men who brought goods like guns, gunpowder, and dried fish. In return, Equiano says, sometimes indeed we sold slaves to them, but they were only prisoners of war. This is a child of somebody who sold people who eventually experienced the same fate after being kidnapped. Let me keep reading. Sometimes we indeed sold slaves to them, but they were only prisoners of war, or such among us that had been convicted of kidnapping or adultery and some other crimes which we esteemed heinous. Kidnapping, that's a crime. Adultery didn't always used to be a crime, especially in the Yoruba community, until it became, and yes, they started banishing for adultery in Yorùbáland too, or falling in love with the wrong person. They'll say, "You better leave, I don't want you to have anything to do with my daughter." And death threats, I mentioned death threats. When a trader wants slaves, he applies to a chief for them, tempts him with his wares, and accepts the price of his fellow creature's liberty with as little reluctance as the enlightened merchant. So, and what were they exchanging people for? Mirrors. After colonization, they started to import mirrors. I explained in the video on, was it last names, that those things, I don't know if anybody who has seen that video will remember, that those things became worthless. Gene became worthless. You could now get it anywhere. What they used to exchange entire human beings for, whole human beings for, now became 1 shilling or 2 shillings, worthless. The Europeans made these things seem like, oh, they are more valuable than they actually were, and they got far more in exchange for these worthless things. It was only until after colonization when they started to import them and make them available for sale for next to nothing. By doing so, they did not only rubbish the so-called wealth that all these elite people that were exchanging humans for them, for these stupid items, they did not only useless their wealth, because now your bottles of gin that you are stored, that you think are worth so much, are now being sold for 1 shilling, and they are probably not even as good as the newer ones that are being imported. So now that is no longer wealth, that is no longer worth anything, and your jeans are no longer worth anything, and your gunpowder is no longer worth as much as you really thought they would be worth. So not only did they destroy the wealth, that people thought they had acquired as a result of participating in the slave trade, they took over the governments. Equiano recounted an incident of an attempted kidnapping of children in his Igbo village. Okay, I'm grateful for the correction here. Which was followed by adults. When he was around the age of 11, he and his sister were left alone to look after their family premises, and they would have been, of course, the father would have been influential if he was a member of the Igbo version of the Ogboni. As was common when adults went out of the house to work, they were both kidnapped and taken far from their own town, separated and sold to slave traders. He tried to escape but was thwarted. After his owners changed several times, Equiano happened to meet with his sister, but they were separated again. 6 or 7 months after he had been kidnapped, he arrived at the coast where he was taken on board an European slave ship. He was transported with 244 other enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to Barbados in the West Indies. Yeah, this Wikipedia article, you should probably, what I like about Wikipedia is sometimes what is in there is wrongly quoted or is not correct, but if you look down at the bottom of the page, it would typically link you to sometimes peer review, sometimes not peer reviewed journals that can help you start your proper research. So anyway, indebtedness and the use of force was another thing. Again, like I mentioned earlier, you can have these guns and this gunpowder. When you come back from the war, from your battle with these people, we'll be waiting for you to determine our terms, kind of thing. Or you will give us your prisoners of war, and we will give you guns, and we will give you gunpowder and coral beads and cotton. Which brings me to the theft of art. Acquiring art for nothing through raids and the use of force, or next to nothing when the owners did not show much resistance, was also occurring at the same time. So it wasn't just people, there were other things being taken away. The missionaries were still doing their thing, the jihadists were there, the trade was going on. It was a really busy century. These 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries were wild for Yoruba people, to say the least. Wild. Not to say that other things were not happening, or that other significant things had never happened in the past, or that's a lie, but they were, at least that we have proper recollection of, because they were not too long ago. They were exceptionally wild. I'm always jealous of the Benin people, because they have this set of pictures that show like British people in the act, so to say. Typically you don't see many pictures. You just hear oral histories, from like one person whose father or mother has mentioned it, and they are now 100-year old. That's why it's important to speak with elders, because they tell you things that are not generally things that you won't find on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. It's really important, because that was their way of passing information on. And since a lot of them cannot read or write in English or Yoruba, in fact, learning how to write in Yoruba is more recent than you think. They typically pass things down by speaking. Nothing beats hearing them talk. So these are some of the things that they stole. See, this look at this person, this disgrace. I don't know who they are, and I don't know if they were probably not a Benin person. There were stories of people joining external forces to fight against their own people as a revenge for being banished. There's stories like that. I don't know how to verify those, but there are stories like that. So joining external, or even like for a few things that the external forces have to offer, betraying their own people, there were stories like that. So these are the many things. I don't know where all this ended up. These are a lot, and these are just a few pictures. These are a lot. Look at them. Look at, probably more at the back. This is just one picture. Look at them. Look at the looters and the raiders. Look at the thieves. Look at what they stole. This is one elephant tusk. They are really significant to the Benin culture. Don't think of, oh, this is just an elephant tusk. No. If you... The British, they destroy one culture, some people's heritage, and they promote another. The ancient Egypt people, they were so much so that Yoruba people, there were certain Yoruba people that Benin people, that started to convince themselves that they were from ancient Egypt or they were from ancient Israel, just because of how those cultures are promoted and pampered. They were civilized. They were this, they were that. But when you destroy our own works of art that show what our life was like several centuries ago, several millenniums ago, how on earth are we going to be able to... Anyway, so just one is this detailed. You can see the arrow, and this looks like a snake, and a lot of them are in private collections. Okay, this one is in the British Museum, but this is just one of how many that was stolen. This look at them. They have meanings. They are not just... This is okay, this looks like a king on a horse, for instance. Look at this one. Is in the British Museum as well, I believe, one section of the museum, or in somebody's or some European's private collection. So that's why I said I'm always jealous of Benin people, because at least when they say, oh, what art are you talking about, what are you talking about, they at least have those sets of pictures to show for it. But we don't have pictures, and life is sort of the, if you don't have picture of it, then it didn't happen. Apart from the fact that, okay, people are starting to recognize our art in these museums, and although we still don't have access to the ones in private collections across Europe and America, at least we can see a few bits and pieces here and there to prove that indeed, if it wasn't stolen, or how come you have this one is typically not given to anybody. Obviously this piece was taken by force, because it's not something that we would typically sell or give out. So this is the king that was exiled, Oba Overanwe. In the 19th century, the kingdom of Benin had managed to retain its independence, and the Oba exercised the monopoly over trade, which the British found irksome. The territory was coveted by an influential group of investors for this Alejo Pataki badness, but then the Alejo Pataki end up being the ones that would destroy you. Maybe I'm not saying we shouldn't have been as friendly to these European investors, these so-called investors, even starting from their initial missionaries that they sent, but I'm just saying. It was coveted for its rich natural resources such as palm oil, rubber, and ivory. The kingdom was largely independent of British control, and pressure continued from figures such as Phillips and Galloway, who were pushing for British annexation of the Benin Empire and the removal of the Oba. A British invasion force headed by Phillips set out to overthrow the Oba in 1896. The force's weapons were hidden in baggage, which troops disguised as bearers. Philip's plan was to gain access to his palace by announcing that he intended to negotiate. So as opposed to killing him, they exiled him. There were certain people that they killed or that they paid, across present-day Nigeria anyway, not just Yoruba people, or that they paid somebody that was a native of that place, of that area, to kill, but they did not kill him. They were overpowered, so he willingly surrendered. He did fight, but he willingly surrendered, because at that point they were just going to kill him anyway. So they sent him to Calabar, but he died soon after, because that's enough to kill you. So king exiled, art stolen. I've shown you 3 of about 50 pictures that are available online of the thieves posing, doing the bidding of their masters. I know that it would be impossible because to get all the stolen art, because a lot of the elites whose descendants, the European elites and American elites, whose descendants are still holding on to the art, are not, they are still in private collections. They are not declaring that they have them. I'm glad that some effort is being made. Refusal to return stolen property due to the concerns that the owners would not know how to manage them is what beats me. If you look at online debates, and the disgraceful part is, even Benin people, I've seen Benin people comment, what museum do we have that is as nice as the European museum? We don't know how to keep them. Let them keep them. You know how much they are making in these museums for showing these works of art. It's like me stealing your phone, and then I say, you don't know how to handle a phone. Let me keep it for you. You held your phone in your mouth. Is that how to keep a phone? Let me hold it for you. There's a way that one can work their human mind to think that that is in fact sensible, but it is, a rational person will say, but it is her phone. give her back her phone. How she handles it is her business. It's not yours. What vexes me is when they return. Look at what was stolen. Look at the few pieces, the ones that are just like smaller items or duplicates they send, and then they hold these huge ceremonies and we've returned. And what happened to the rest? Why are you returning 2 of the smaller ones that they are probably 3 or 4 extras of, the ones that are not like heads, or the ones that don't depict people, the ones that are like, this one is a kind of bird, for instance, spreading its wings. This is an iron bell, one of the traditional ones. Certain things used to be in the heads. I'm not sure what they were, and we're still trying to figure out, but especially the ones that are many centuries or a few millenniums old. Those holes were not left like that. They were filled with something. Whatever those somethings were, probably they've been stolen. We are certain that they were not holes, but we don't know what some people have the theory that those holes used to have like beads attached to them. Some say that they were gold. People have their own theories regarding what those holes used to be filled with, but each of them is a depiction of an important person. So some of these people, not all, would have been Onis. Some of them would have been other influential men and women. Each of them, you see their diverse faces, is a depiction of how one of our ancestors used to look like. These ones are not pictures of the ones that were stolen during the madness, the slave trade era. These ones were stolen recently. Some other ones before then that were stolen in that era looked like this. It wasn't just heads. Why UK police are holding up a priceless sculpture? So I think somebody stole this one. British police are keeping a stolen statue worth millions of dollars in their custody as dispute rages between a Belgian antiques dealer and a Nigerian museum over its ownership. This one was stolen from a museum in 1987. Even long after that forceful taking of art era, they are still stealing or paying people to steal on their behalf. I don't know, it's a sick fascination with our art. Fulani jihadists captured and enslaved thousands of people in regions that showed resistance to the kind of Islamic colonization and annexation that was successful in other places. And you should read this, The African Slave Boy memoir. I'm going to show his own account in a letter of what his experience was. So, in a letter that he wrote in 1841, he apparently stated, "I was sold to the Portuguese as whose first torch I almost trampled to death. Being embarked from the town in canoes in an evening about 7 o'clock to be shipped early the next day, we gave ourselves up totally for lost. We could not tell where our miseries would end, especially as we thought there was no safety in the land nor on the sea." That's profound, particularly at sea. That's even more profound. I have to say that our willingness to go swimming, I've said it before, the black people can't swim, black people can't do this thing. Some of it involves a bit of generational trauma. Before the Portuguese ships and all that, the beaches in Lagos, people would go there, people would have fun there, people would play there, people would wash their clothes there, people would bathe there. But when they became ports for slave traders, the people started to avoid the water, because the closer you are to water, the closer you are to danger. So the willingness to teach children how to swim, to encourage children to go swimming, to be comfortable with water, with being submerged in water, is a thing that has lasted for a while. And some of it is, if we don't retrace our steps anyway, that's what I'm trying to say in essence, if we don't look at the history, we will never understand some things in a bid, particularly in a bid to heal them, in the bid to heal them. If we don't acknowledge certain things, we would never be able to move forward. A lot of the fear of water is a result of this era. So I'm not glad to see it written, by the way, but I'm happy that he was able to express what he must have been feeling when he wrote this in this way. In the morning, contrary to our prejudices against the English, we were all ordered up on deck and were surprised when our masters were found in irons and their slaves were at liberty. So this was the era when the British eradicated slavery and they were resettling people who the Portuguese had. They were working hand in. There was this triangle, before they eradicated it. There was this triangle. But then the British decided that they were not for slavery anymore after a series of events. So they started to go after the people that they helped enslave people. They started to go after them, get enslaved people off their ships and resettle them in Sierra Leone, especially Freetown and Sierra Leone. So a lot of people in Sierra Leone today are originally Yorùbá people. We're all ordered up on deck and were surprised when our masters were found in irons and were at liberty. As hunger rendered us bold and we were not threatened at our approaching the coconuts and other fruit on the quarterdeck, we soon fell to devour up everything edible that we could get so as to satisfy the cravings of hunger. we began to entertain good opinions of our new conquerors. After breakfast, all the slaves were divided between two other brigs, which were alongside of us. We 6 boys had the luck of being taken into the Mire Medan, where we were very kindly treated. The number of all the slaves was, I think, 189, out of whom 102 perished in the sea. That's a lot. When we were landed at Sierra Leone, we were placed in a school under the care of the Church Missionary Society. That body is served until, you could say, the end of his life, really. You can't dismiss his significance, but there were a few wrongs that he did with how with his translations and with the presentation of the culture. But I understand, probably because he felt like he owed this particular set of people in his life. There I was taught to read the word of God, which is able to make all men wise unto salvation. It pleased the Lord to open my heart like that of Lydia. I attended unto those things which were spoken of by servants, and according to my desire I was admitted into the visible church of Christ here on earth as a soldier to fight manfully under his banner against our spiritual enemies, the world, the flesh, and the devil. On missionary relations with native religions and Islam, from Samuel Crowther, The Gospel on the Banks of the Niger. Had we been obstinate in opposing native religions, Christian missionaries would long ago have been turned out of the country, the converts put to death, and the country would have been long barred against the message of salvation. And what is said there is they didn't take the jihadist approach, in essence. But what is the result of the caution and the prudence exercised? The whole country is open to us. Stations are occupied in different directions. Churches are built. Congregations are collected, and converts are numbered by hundreds. And yet we do not make the least compromise. With the Muslims of this country, cannot a like cause be tried? You see, considering that it was the jihadist Fulanis that attacked Oshogun, that attacked where he was born, and he was what, the grandson of a king or something. He had rights to the throne and everything, and they came to destabilize his life, and kidnap him. Cannot a like cause be tried? Can you not use the tricks, the friendliness that the British used? Can you not use that? Of course, we know that it's a friendliness to an end. Obviously, they are not any nicer, but I guess that would have meant a lot to him if you think about how he was captured in the first place. To say that can they not try a softer approach? Although the so-called people who use that soft approach, or who he would have loved to associate with that softer approach, were not soft at all. They have great respect for the books of Moses, the prophet is talking about the natives here, and the Psalms, and to some extent for the gospel of Christ also, all of which they know mostly by name. If they be quietly referred to these books, the law of Moses, the prophets, the Psalms, and the gospel in all things concerning Christ himself, we may thus have opportunity of bringing before their minds the wholesome substance of those blessed books. Our undue rashness in quarreling with, and our untimely exposure of Islam can do no good, but may irritate. They are perishing. We were perishing for want of the spiritual food of the gospel. We were dying. We needed Jesus so badly. To have the bread and water of life taken away from them by our being turned out of the country in defense of Islam through an injurious action would be to them the greatest injury possible. It should also be remembered that God, who has permitted the religion of Muhammad to last so long and to overspread on earth, please, it's in his own words, by the way, can easily remove it when he pleases without any violence or rash. Okay, now this one is his cup of tea, but if you can read that later. But if you read this, watch this YouTube video, The Black Bishop, the story of Ajayi Crowther. So some of the battles that were directly responsible for, the ones that we can name, the ones that we remember to this day, that we can name. The Daomian one, they attacked the Abeokuta people. That it wasn't just one. I don't think it was two either. It must have been quite a couple, although different in scale. And most of the fighters were all the fighters were women. The Daomian army at the time that attacked Abeokuta at the time, they were being forced to fight as well. That's the thing. Some of them too are Eru fighters, are refugee. Don't look at it as feminism and women power and queens. Yes. In reality, that wasn't really this King Gemo. I don't know if this is him seated or somebody else. It was a different kind of under his high, really. Those battles provided a lot of slaves that were sold on this Atlantic Ocean banks, and a lot of people hid under these rocks, under the Olumo rock. The rock is still honored. This is the main shrine for protecting people back then, for housing people. They raided that area, those Daomian warriors, but maybe they didn't think to climb the rocks and check, or maybe it didn't. Anyway, till today, the rock is a huge rock, and I don't think anybody has fallen off of it. The rock has its own life, and the rock is a protector, almost literally. One of the Daomian battles resulted in Princess Aino being enslaved by the Daomians, but she was kind of fortunate in the sense that she had Queen Victoria's assistance. The Daomian army killed her parents. I think until even much later into her life, she was still scared of that king. There was a time when she was to visit West Africa and she was still very frightened from the narration. So she was given as a gift. She was really young, and this is a sketch of what she looked like when she was brought to England, and she was extremely intelligent, and I think that one was noted as well. She was a very fast learner, and she ended up marrying this Mr. Davis. She was captured from Okeodon, so they killed the king, her father. They killed one of the queens, her mother. They killed the other queens as well, and they captured the natives, including her, probably her brothers and sisters as well. I was trying to find an autobiography of her story, but one, she was really young. Two, some things are just really hard to note. There are not many pieces of work that detail her narrating her experience herself. But yeah, it was as a result of one of the Daomian attacks of Abeokuta, General Yorùbáland, Okeodon, all those parts. I also have to mention that Ajayi Crowther, Sarah Bonetta, these are not the only people that were royal, that were captured or enslaved, even within Yorùbáland, even beyond. They were recognized by the queen. He later met Queen Victoria and read the Lord's Prayer to her in Yoruba, which she described as softer and melodious. So we tend to remember these people, but don't forget there were several others. Many people did not want to admit when they were captured that they were royal, for the fear that perhaps it might lead to them being punished harder than the rest of the natives or something. So that's another thing. Many people did not, when they were captured or kidnapped, or they did not disclose their identity in case the punishment that would be levied against them would be higher. So they are not the only people. We remember them, but please know that those are not the only places that were raided, and they were not the only people that were either part of the reigning monarchy, children, uncles, or had connections to the reigning monarchy, or were in line to the throne even. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were already transporting Africans for use as enslaved laborers on the sugar plantations in the Cape Verde and Madeira Islands in the eastern Atlantic. Spanish conquistadors took enslaved Africans to the Caribbean after 1502, but Portuguese merchants continued to dominate the transatlantic slave trade for another century and a half That's 150 years or thereabouts, operating from their bases in the Congo-Angola area along the west coast of Africa. The Dutch became the foremost traders of enslaved people during parts of the 1600s, and in the following century, English and French merchants controlled about half of the transatlantic slave trade, taking a large percentage of their human cargo from the region of West Africa between the Senegal and Niger rivers. In 1713, an agreement between Spain and Britain granted the British a monopoly on the trade of enslaved people with the Spanish colonies. Under the Asiento de Negro, Britain was entitled to supply those colonies with 4,800 enslaved Africans per year for 30 years. Let me read that again. Britain was entitled to supply those colonies with 4,800 enslaved Africans per year for 30 years. The contract for this supply was assigned to the South Sea Company, of which the British Queen Anne held some 22.5% of the stock. Why I'm saying this is, don't look at even the British. I've just explained what they did in-house in the 1900s to us. I've explained the Yoruba people that they killed and everything. Don't look at them through rose-colored glasses, because if you do, you would have issues. There was a reason why we wanted our independence in the first place. Don't ever forget. For the people who are calling on the British government to come and rule, because they can't rule, I hope you can think, oh, they rescued Samuel Ajayi Crowther, and oh, we were savages, and they civilized. Really? Really? See how the effrontery though is the gods for me. It's just crazy to me. When people sing this song near me, especially Africans, when they sing the song with so much zeal, I just laugh. This, not just Amazing Grace, but similar songs by similar authors with the same story of them being slave traders, of them being involved in the slave trade. Newton wrote the words, Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved the wretch like him. That song. Newton wrote the words from personal experience. He grew up without any particular religious conviction, but his past life was formed by a variety of twists and coincidences that were often put into motion by others' reactions to what they took as his recalcitrant insubordination. It was pressed into the Royal Navy. After leaving the service in 1748, a violent storm battered his vessel off the coast of Donegal, Ireland, so severely that he called out to God for mercy. This moment marked his spiritual conversion, but he continued slave trading until 1754. So, that money though, those benefits though of selling people, it was convinced of Christ, but that selling people though was looking mighty good until 1755, when he ended his seafaring altogether. Newton began studying Christian theology and later became an abolitionist. Joseph Sinkers, the brave Congolese chief who prefers death to slavery and who now lies in jail in Hyams at New Haven, awaiting his trial for daring for freedom. I told you what they would do. I think it's the only real king or the only real queen is the Queen of England thing that they would do. So the kings of smaller regions they would refer to as chiefs, and then the main kings, the ones that you could call emperors, they would refer to as district head or something. They intentionally chose not to address all these kings as kings just because of they felt that the only true king is in fact, until today, many people still say that stupid thing. Even among Yoruba people, say one lo si lu oba tibo. They still think the real king is in fact the king in England. They will say ilu oba, the the land of the king. So we still have remnants of that stupidity even in our own language. So don't be surprised if you hear one wà nílùú ọba, ọba bo, ṣọba afẹ àbọba, ọba Abẹ́òkúta àbọba ọba bo, ṣé ọba ìlú ẹ̀, ṣé ìlú òyìnbó lẹ fẹ́ sọ, ìlú èbò, kí ló ń jẹ́ ìlú ọba? What is ìlú ọba? So this would have been a king just of a smaller region. But anyway, let me continue. Speech to his comrade slaves after murdering the captain and getting possession of the vessel. So his real name I don't know, but this is one important figure amongst the people. Yes, we appreciate people like stories like Django and all that. You know, some of it is fiction. A lot of it included things that actually happened or that are slightly based off of reality. But we should also not forget about the real stories of the real people that fought back. Not just on the ships, but after they got to the place. Many of them eventually hung and all that, but at least they fought back. Let's try to actively seek to know their, don't know if seek to know their colonial names, but seek to know them irrespective of whatever colonial name they are now identified with. Atrocities and sexual abuse of the enslaved captives were widespread, although their monetary value as slaves perhaps mitigated such treatment. Ship captains could not ignore the health of their human cargo because they were paid only for enslaved persons delivered alive. Moreover, the death rates among the European captains and crew engaged in the trade of enslaved people were at least as high as those among their captives on the Middle Passage. In an infamous incident on the slave ship Zong in 1781, when both Africans and crew members were dying of an infectious disease, Collingwood, hoping to stop the disease, ordered that more 130 Africans be thrown overboard. He then filed an insurance claim on the value of the murdered enslaved persons. Occasionally, the African captives successfully revolted and took over the ships. The most famous such incident occurred in 1839. A slave named Joseph Sink led a mutiny of 53 illegally purchased enslaved people on the Spanish slave ship Amistad, killing the captain and 2 members of the crew. The US court eventually ordered the Africans to be returned to their homes. Again, this was not the only one. This is just one of the more famous ones. At the time of the American Revolution, there was widespread support for prohibiting the importation of more enslaved people. However, after the revolution, at the insistence of southern states, Congress waited more than 2 decades before making the importation of enslaved people illegal. When Congress did so in that didn't stop it too. The making it illegal thing, that didn't stop it too, by the way, but that's a story for another day. In 1808, the law was enacted with little dissent, but Caribbean smugglers frequently violated the law, until it was enforced by the northern blockade of the South in 1861 during the American Civil War. After Great Britain outlawed slavery through its empire in 1833, after benefiting so much, Queen Anne, Queen Anne and all the other British royals that enjoyed from the wealth that was gathered then, they were supplying 4,000 slaves for how many years? The British Navy diligently opposed the trade of enslaved people in the Atlantic, which would have been around the time that Ajayi Crowther was taking off one, and used its ships to try to prevent slave trading operations. Brazil outlawed the trade of enslaved people in 1850, but the smuggling of newly enslaved persons into Brazil did not end until 1888. King Jaja of Opobo, not Yorùbá by the way, but it really doesn't have to be. All their stories are valid and pretty similar across ethnic groups and cultures. He was a king. So some of them were exiled, some of them were sold into slavery, whole entire kings. At the 1884 Berlin Conference, however, however, the other European powers designated Opobo as British territory, and the British soon moved to claim it. When Jaja refused to cease taxing British traders, this Royal Niger Company and their is the audacity for me. Henry Johnston, a British vice consul, invited Jaja to negotiations in 1884. By September of that year, Johnson brought a warship named HMS, whatever the hell, to Okpobo and invited Jaja on board. He assured Jaja that nothing would happen to him. See how they captured an entire king. When he went on board, he was given two bad choices by Johnson. One was that if he would not allow the Europeans access, he could go back and face immediate bombardment from the British Navy. And the other, that he goes into exile. Jaja, being a man of strong values and principles, chose not to back down. The British arrested him and tried him in Accra in the Gold Coast, now Ghana, then took him to the atrocities they perpetrated in Ghana too. Mini Sokoko. I've been speaking for how many hours, but Mini Sokoko. Then took, because of the gold, then took him to London for some time, where he met Queen Victoria and was a guest in Buckingham Palace. No one knew what transpired between him and the Queen, but after some time, he was finally deported to the West Indies. Obviously not something good. The fact that he was not taken back home. They seized him, took him to Ghana, took him to the Queen. Whatever they discussed probably didn't go too well. Took him to the West Indies, an entire king. While in exile in the Caribbean, his presence was alleged to be the cause of immense civil unrest among the people of Barbados. After years of campaigning for his freedom, Jaja was moved to the island of São Vicente, Cape Verde, off the coast of West Africa, to prevent the possibility of a revolt. Jaja eventually won his liberty after years of fighting against his wrongful abduction, and it was agreed by the parliament that he could be repatriated to his kingdom state of Okpobo. Jaja, now well advanced in age, longed to see his beloved Yorùbáland again. Now this is the twist. The people of Barbados, mostly of people of African descent, they had heard rumors that an African, at this point it was no longer king of the Igbo or king of the, just a king, to an entire king, to see their own king of where they are from being treated like that. So I think that was what caused the unrest. They heard that the African king was being captured and is now on his way to the island. They all rallied themselves together to give him a befitting reception. It was quite an interesting episode of his life in Barbados. The British brought him and wanted to try him on the island for his crimes. The people of the island felt insulted about how an African king had been subjected to such ridicule and shame. Just when the ship made berth at the waterside, the people of the island rushed and camped at the waterside to avoid the British bringing Jaja to the colonial courthouse in the middle of the village's square. They literally camped at the waterside throughout the night, the people protecting their king. Again, if you don't actively seek out this part of history, it won't come to you. You have to try to learn these things. I know that I've said a lot, but I've barely said anything really compared to the actual set of events. The next day, which was Sunday, the people of the island held their church service on the waterside right by the ship. Jaja was seen looking through as the service goes on. Before the service was over, he came out and there was a loud cry amongst the women welcoming him. And by the way, a lot of them that were taken became Christians because they had to. They were not free to practice the traditional spiritual systems, so they had to do Christianity, but they still found a way to hide what they had created or what they had in honor of their deities, sculptures and things that they were able to make, the ones that were sculptors among them, and they were able to hide them behind edifices of Jesus and Mary and all that. That's why we have a lot of syncretism today. At the time they had no choice but to syncretize. It was better than nothing. But a lot of them were on paper Christians. Jaja was seen looking through as the service goes on. Before the service was over, he came out and there was a loud cry amongst the women welcoming him, a king from the ancestral motherland. The crowd went hysterical. The British feared that they may plan an escape plan for him, got their bags and sailed back to St. Vincent. It was moved around from one place to the other around the West Indies so that his family lineage can be traced in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It was even at the time that he got married and okay, so he had children. Okay. Jaja in the West Indies is a common slang for someone who is arrogant and carries himself or herself with an air of pride and dignity. Coined after the way King Jaja himself held his head up while he was on the island. In 1891, Jaja was granted permission to return to Opobo, but he died en route, allegedly poisoned with a cup of tea in June. Probably because they knew that if he came back home and immobilized his own people, then they would be back to square one. So yes, they killed him, most likely. His body was shipped instead to Tenerife in the Canary Islands, where he was buried. So he never actually made it back home. Following his exile and death, the power of the Opobo state rapidly declined. The land was plagued with slave raids, riots, and the British exploited the land for its natural resources. The exploitation of that land has continued even long to the that was the 1800s, centuries after, at least a century after. This Kensarowiwa, oh my goodness, the sacrifice that he had to pay in the defense of his land, oh my goodness. It was an environmental activist that had issues with how Shell and other companies, see, the Royal Dutch Shell Company, Shell for short, was mistreating their land for its resources, for the oil, for the several other things that they get, crude oil, several other things that they get from the land. The land has been targeted for crude oil extraction since the 50s. Oh, definitely before. Definitely before. What are you talking about? The 50s? When was the 50s? Please. Way before. And which has suffered extreme environmental damage from over a century of indiscriminate petroleum. Well, if it's petroleum waste dumping, then probably within the era that they've cited. If it is the stealing of resources and doing what they like with the land, or way before. But if it is with indiscriminate petroleum waste dumping, then it may have, yes, begun in the 1900s. Initially as a spokesperson and then as the president of the movement of the survival of the Ogoni people, Sarawiwa led a non-violent campaign against the environmental degradation of the land and waters of Ogoni land by the operations of the multinational petroleum industry, especially the Royal Dutch Shell, the stupid Dutch Shell Company. Is also known as a critic of the Nigerian government for its allegedly reluctant behavior to enforce environmental regulations on the foreign petroleum companies operating in the area. The using kings as the kini kolon what there are certain sayings that relate to it. They still do that thing where they use your own people as shields. They use your own government. But as it has been, not that it's though, maybe this past few 3, 4, 5 centuries. At the peak of his non-violent campaign, he was tried by a special military tribunal for allegedly masterminding the gruesome murder of Ogoni chiefs at a pro-government meeting. How would he have? he was lied against and hung in 1995 by the military dictatorship of this disgrace. The same thing they did to King Jaja. When you Google a person's name like this, Delegiwa was also another person that was killed with a letter bomb, parcel bomb, for speaking against the madness. I'm still looking for a movie that will present people who were enslaved as people. There's always a lot of emphasis on they were flogged, they were beaten, they were this, they were that. And we've seen a lot of that aspect, yes, which we are grateful for. But we also need an aspect of their lives that show them as human beings, with feelings and emotions. There are, again, things are always looked at from an American perspective. It's always about the massa. There were cases where certain escapes were planned, or certain plans were made by those who had been enslaved, but or maybe somebody was planning to escape or something, where the person who knew about it decided to report to the so-called nuisance that wanted to be referred to as the master. So there were cases where you felt like, okay, you betrayed your own people, you are the Uncle Johnson, you are the Uncle Rockers, you are the this, you are the that. But I'm almost certain that it wasn't always about the massa. If you find the child of the person that enslaved you on the same plantation as you, and they are planning to escape, and you are still hurt about it, in cases that involve telltale and betrayals, it may have been much more than just, so that I can be a house servant or something, or house slave. It wasn't always about the master. It wasn't always about getting a particular advantage. Some of it would have involved a bit of revenge as well, seeing maybe a member of the Oro that was involved in your capture somehow captured, and on the same plan, were you not one of the that sold me, that somehow banished me and made me end up here, and you want to escape? We'll see about that. So just keep that in mind, that they had a life before they were brought to this foreign land. So everything is not about massa. Of course, not a lot of people understand it. So I know that there would be a concern about misinterpreting it, and the people that are going to get upset about it in this day and age, so they just leave it alone to just American context. But I'd like to see them as people, and the preservation of their culture and their compositions, and because they were not allowed to read and write, they would not have documented, which doesn't help. A lot of things will be largely based on imagination, and a lot of things may come up as inaccurate if people don't really know, but we would really like to see. And also, I wanted to say, lineage tracing and its challenges, it was significantly aided by all the 17th, 19th, especially 19th century battles. So Ijaye war, this war, that war, Shogbo war, this, people were moving around. So brothers and sisters may be able to trace their lineages to certain parts of present day Nigeria, but they may not be accurate, because except you have like a really detailed, a really genuine source of information, it's really hard to tell where you are. Were they always there, or did they settle there, or sometimes it's really hard to tell. So that's the reason why the battles and the displacements are some of the reasons why lineage tracing is hard today. I'm getting closer to the end. About reparations, we Yoruba people say, if you nurse a sick person to health, when they get up from the sick bed and they stretch, oh yes, I really needed that stretch. When they stretch, they will clench their buttocks and fart. That is how they say thank you. What that is saying is, don't really expect thank you from the wrong person. So to say, I don't know how to interpret that properly in English, but that's what it is. Like, it's a very deep statement. So I don't know if there are any English words, but this is what it means, word for word, literally. A sick person expresses gratitude with farts. And they get up from their sick. Oh, you took care of me. That's how they say thank you. So they fill your nostrils with odor. That's how they say thank you. So I don't know with reparations. I don't know the ways that the enslavers have said thank you is through racism and through discrimination, even till this day, decades after. So I don't know. Also, when I was making the draft, this came to mind. The children of slaves rhetoric that Africans say. Ignorance. Stupidity is bad. Ignorance is, at the end of the day, maybe not bliss, because there are many, and I shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it. There are many people who are kings in present day Yorùbáland today, whose family line did not have a right to the throne, but one or two things changed and somehow they ended up being in line. And there are many people in America today, South Carolina, many people in Brazil today, many people in Cuba today. Somebody is a child of a slave. Oh, I almost awkward. They took princes, they took princesses, they took kings, they took chiefs, they took members of the Ogboni, they took all kinds of people. So it's not don't ever say. Some Africans don't know how stupid they sound when they refer to African Americans and Cubans and Brazilians in a derogatory manner. What do you think made it happen? Who are the people that suffered through tears, blood, sweat, their lives? Who protested that despite the lynchings and the young and old, from people like what was the name of this young boy that was lynched just by merely looking at a white woman? Oh, your eyes met mine, lynch him. I guess even not, the thing is, it was not just one boy. So to be able to enjoy all these benefits today because somebody from where I'm from or their descendants suffered for the kind of life that we have today, to be able to enjoy this and then come here and say, oh, I'm African. Black African Americans think they are being oppressed. It's all in their head. What a stupid thing to say. What an ungrateful thing to say. You come here, you're able to study, you're able to go to the schools that Europeans can go to, you're able to enjoy all the benefits. Some people come in 9 years, they already have a fleet of cars, they already have a number of houses, good jobs. They're able to practice medicine in the schools that Europeans are able to, Americans from European descent are able to attend, and to just say, oh, white people like me, I'm special, I'm not oppressed. We were never oppressed. They are lazy. Mi ò dẹ̀ yọ sọ, mo sọ gbogbo àyà mo fi sọ, orí yín ò dá. Lastly, I'm going to leave you with this, because like I said, we have all these so-called investors from Asia. Tá gbọ́dọ̀ dákọ. Mo tiẹ̀ ti dárúkọ wọn tẹ́lẹ̀, I've mentioned them. and all these other parts of the world, really, not to single those ones out, destroying our lands, destroying our properties, buying off the lands where they suspect that there is gold or other natural resources, and it's still continuing to this day, and we are in so much debt. Remember, there was a time when through debt you owe us a lot for the guns and the gunpowder that we provided you, but you can pay with slaves though. See, we are in debt, and the ways in which those debts are being settled, directly or indirectly, affect us, affect each individual in Africa, in Nigeria specifically. Let me keep it to Africa. Let me keep it to the parts of Africa that I'm from, Nigeria. So, we often say, Bí ìdí bá bàjẹ́, tó nídìí ló ń dà. If the buttocks, it is not just buttocks, it's also the private part in general, you know. If the private parts are damaged, they become the problem of the it doesn't translate very well in English. If the buttocks are, if the private parts are damaged, they become the problem of the private part owner. It doesn't anybody who knows, who speaks Yoruba, will tell you that it's a lot more interesting in Yoruba than it sounds in English. Bidi babaje, Tony di donda. So tell you about Gaji. Don't let me get too graphic. If you open your, actually that's graphic too. If you make your nyash, your private parts available for consumption, so to say, tonkobo. If they get loose, or they slack, or they or your backside starts to leak, you won't go to the person who slept with you and say, we made love last week, oh, my yash is leaking. Honestly, it becomes your own problem. You are the owner of the yash. You have to deal with it. Yes, when the person was cowboying, you were one, so to say. But they've gone. The ruined yash is now your problem. I don't know how. No, I don't know how to say it in such a way that you can grasp. Bí ìdí bá bàjẹ́, tó nídìí ló ń dà. If you allow ajá to come, kobo, ẹran to come, kobo, ìnàkí will come, kobo, all this kobo, and they ruin your land like they've done. I mean, the more we try to fix things, these colonial powers, in one way or another, through one company or another, through one institution or another, are still, including America, are still very much enjoying certain things from us. We owe them so much. I don't know how much we owe America, or how much we've been given in grants. Also, there's a problem of corruption and all that. What a pity. Just the way we had corrupt chiefs and actual kings back then, corrupt people, we still have not much. I think the understanding of history lets you realize that not much changes. It's all it has been a cycle so far. Within the past few millenniums, it has just been same old, just in another form, with another name. Bí ìdí bá bàjẹ́, tó nídìí ló ń dà. If you destroy your land and you destroy your heritage, tiyín ló máa dà. I think it's one of the hilariously intense sayings. Bí ìdí bá, once you imagine it, then it gets funny. Bí ìdí bá bàjẹ́, tó nídìí ló ń. I'm going to leave it at that because I know I've said a lot. I have said a lot. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. If you want any link or any recommendation that is particular to what I've discussed today, just because that's the one I did a fair bit of research on, whether oral oral links or something like that, or you want me to connect you with a certain person, or if I'm able to, just feel free to ask. Any resource, I try to show the names of everything that I read from, but if you still have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next video. Oh, thank you to my patrons and my YouTube members. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you in the next one. Enjoy the rest of your day, and bye for now.